And welcome everyone to another adventure into reality. I am joined by Douglas Dietrich and Laura Lee Solomon for our part two special, where we'll be discussing relic species, relic populations, and how all the different people see relic species and relic populations. What do the various esoteric traditions say about them? Douglas, Laura, welcome to the show today.
Great to be here. How about with yourself, Laura Lee?
It's wonderful. I've got a cup of hot coffee and a cat on my lap, and we're ready to go.
Oh,
Yeah.
what is the name of the cat?
Baby girl.
Baby girl. Well, everyone, we have an incredible show for you. For those of you listened to the first one and put all the comments on the YouTube page and on the Facebook page, thank you so much. It was just a heck of a first show, and I want to thank both Douglas and Laura Lee. You guys really wowed a lot of people with the way you guys laid information out.
Well, it's all thanks to your questioning and your ability to bring that information out. We look forward to more of that tonight.
Well, thank you. So let's get started talking about the relic populations and what the different esoteric traditions say about them.
Okay. And, I'll let you kind of guide us through with some trigger questions and
Yeah.
kind of bring the information out.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the esoteric traditions, as far as I know them, have been tarot and Kabbalah, and a lot of the literature of the Rosicrucian tradition. And one of the first books I ever got a hold of that had the word Rosicrucian in the title was Max Heindel's Rosicrucian Cosmoconception. And that truly goes into the idea of the evolution of life on Earth as waves of consciousness coming forth from source to develop first bodies and then the beingness and consciousness to use those bodies, and all under the guidance of spiritual influences from higher levels of being. So Max talks about some rather extensive epochs of evolution: the Polarian, the Hyperborean, the Lemurian, and it doesn't really make a great deal of sense in terms of archaeological history as we know it, except in that it is one of the true things about Kabbalah and tarot in particular is that the life force is depicted as a serpent because it's kind of got a wave function to it, a sinusoidal shape. And it depicts the ongoing life as kind of like waves of the sea, and it comes in and it makes developments, it recedes a bit, and then it comes back in like an incoming tide with troughs and crests to the wave, so that with each wave life pushes forward and it develops new forms, but the old ones can linger on. There's significant proof that the Cro-Magnon, which are presumably modern man, and the what was the earlier race, the Neanderthal, had a significant period of coexistence, and are even other species documented in the archaeological record, like the Denisovians, that they can trace some of the genetic influences, but they aren't sure about that, and this is all part of that ongoing development of life.
Right.
So I would expect there to be relic populations of human beings.
That would include giant populations, multi-armed populations, undersea populations, so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily mean human-looking, but maybe humanoid shape. We hear about reptilians a lot now, but you don't hear a lot about undersea life or some of the other relic populations, that didn't make it to the common seven races of the seven colors that we have going on now.
Hmm.
But they still survive somehow. You look in the genetic record, there's always people that are 6, 7, 8 feet tall. I think the tallest person now is, 8'9"?
Oh, at least, and
Yeah.
I certainly am aware of the existence of the giant skeletons. There are many people who do a lot of research into giantism, and they're certainly specialists in that. And not quite sure if I could donate much to that specifically tonight, but I'm going to bring out whatever comes up in my mind and my memory based on experiences and what work I did with documentation. By the way, Laura Lee, with what you brought up, there's a lot of similarity there to the ages and epochs that were described by Madame Blavatsky in Theosophy. Is there
Yes.
any kind of comparison that you can give us between that perspective and what you learned with your own esoteric research?
I haven't looked at the theosophical tradition closely in all those respects, but I do think that any of the traditions will talk about something akin to that. Um, I mean, there was a method to the development of life, and when the Bible takes the thing and reduces it to and God said, I've always believed that there was a lot more to it than that, and there was a whole process that resulted from it that perhaps took a long time to develop.
Right.
So
Yeah.
other types of relic species and populations would be the Vedics or the times of the Mahabharata, where their information was somehow saved and stored up to the next generation, turned it into myth. And one of the
Yes,
big things the archaeologists can do is anything that they don't understand, they call myth or fable,
true,
and
true.
they don't allow that it was observed as fact for some form of people or species back in an ancient day.
Yes.
Well, I
And
can. There's a really clear example of that I've come across recently, and it's the idea of the Homeric poems of the Iliad.
Yes.
Yes, and the whole idea that it was there in Turkey is kind of ridiculous on a geographical point of view, but there are places in England that fit the descriptions given in the Iliad exactly, where they have found tremendous fields loaded with Bronze Age weaponry. And there's at least one author out there, I think I don't quite remember his name at this point, but they wrote a book called Where Troy Once Stood, and they are very clear that they believe it was in England, and part of that population withdrew into the Mediterranean area and took their place names with them, just like the folks here in the Americas and in Australia did when they started naming places for English settlements. So
Or the
there are
fact that you have like the Cree Indians in northern Canada that speak Jewish. That's their native language.
Hebrew.
Hebrew. It's the classic concepts like that of culture exchange that should have never happened because of the base of the distance, but it
Right.
did.
right. And well, I think that it's important from the perspective of many of our listeners who are Christian, as well as many of our listeners who are in the New Age, that we have this concept of a jealous God. And the jealous God, of course, is probably most evident when it comes to Exodus. I believe it's 34:14, where he says, "Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous," or the Hebrew word koana for jealous, God's very name being jealous, is a jealous God. Now, of course, the reason that God is a jealous God is because there are other gods, dark gods, gods who have created other races in their own terrible image, and they too believe that they shall inherit the earth, if not the universe. So it's of those gods and some of the races that they created that we'll be going a bit into tonight, Andrew and I. And I think that Laura Lee Solomon has done us a tremendous service. She herself is going to be brought in later on in the conversation, and certainly is invited to come on into the conversation whenever she feels that there's something that needs to be emphasized. And I would really appreciate that. And I'll certainly be asking her to look up some stuff for me while she's available. She's going to be up very early tomorrow following this pre-recording that we're doing right now to be producing for another program with an affiliate of ours, Christine Joanna Hart, and her own program, The Queen of Heart, on Revolution Radio, from which both Laura Lee Solomon and myself have our own programs. I myself, of course, with the Critical Omissions on Tuesday nights and the Saturday Night Firing Lines on the weekend. And both of those are available on the schedule at www.freedomslips.com. From Freedom's Lips to Your Ears. And the lovely Laura Lee Solomon has her own program on Paths of the Great Adventure, which is on very late Friday night, very early Saturday morning. And so obviously the morrow after this pre-recording, and it's already the morrow in some time zones, while we're pre-recording with Andrew Bartzi's The Galactic Historian on his GNN or Galactic News Network, the morrow is a very busy day for her. So with that in mind, Laura Lee, was there anything else that you thought might be important to bring up before I kind of just dive into some private experiences with Andrew here?
Well, he had mentioned cultural exchanges that were not theoretically possible, and it is something that was worked out by Charles Hapgood in his Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, that there was worldwide trade at an earlier time than had been assumed possible by traditional, well, standard, let's say, academic.
That's understanding that the history has been rewritten over and over again since 400 AD, and the accuracy of claims of Columbus Day. Many people regard Columbus Day as the day of the invasion, but I see Columbus Day as something that's going to mark a whole new point of history and understanding. It's when they wanted mass amounts of people to go from one place to another to begin a big process of separating the populations, as well as taking other populations that were over, because America's was full of all sorts of relic populations that inherited cultural mounds, pyramids, etc.
Right. Well, there was definitely far more species in America than are acknowledged, other than in the cryptic records of the Department of Defense, where I was a research librarian for almost a decade, where, of course, other humanoid species, what we would call in the popular vernacular Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Very important to remember, of course, Sasquatch is not a Native American word. It never was. It's a synthesis or a neologism that combines several Native American words that was put together by European Americans extremely recently in linguistic history. We're talking about maybe like half a century of age or use, if that the term Sasquatch has had, and it's barely more respectable than the word that I find really annoying and fairly ridiculous, the term Bigfoot. But what we are talking about is various kinds of hominids or humanoid primates on the North American continent that very much do exist. They're not necessarily what I'm going to be getting into too much tonight, if at all, because there are many people, again, who do a lot of research into that. My own experiences have been with different types of species that have been far less, shall we say, reported upon because of various infatuations that the public has with certain species that have been brought to their attention, and understandably so. Local people, we can call them that, people, local species of population like the Bigfoot or hominids of North America, etc. So that's understandable. You want to know what's going on in your own backyard. Of course, there are many other things that are going on since now the world is your backyard as a military empire that expands itself all over the world. And even though that empire is likely going to be in withdrawal and disarray and total collapse within the very near future, it's very important to take a look at what your empire has stirred up in various parts of the world. And with Andrew Bartzi's permission, I'll kind of start diving into that.
One of the things that you're going to touch on is the Chochoa. So let's dive right in there.
Sure. I think the Chochoa are something that's very important to get into. A lot of people have affiliated that with my name at this point. They know that I speak of them often, and I will get into that. And that brings us back into the Second World War. It brings us back into the war that's going on today and America's obsession with worldwide conflict. But I think a good place to start might be my own war, so to speak, which was the Gulf War, or Gulf War II. known as the Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. And Gulf War II differentiates it from the first Gulf War, which I was also a part of as a civilian at a very young age when I was in high school and majoring in commercial illustration, and of course a librarian's aide at the Presidio military base. The Presidio military base, of course, was one of the most important bases in the United States, shall we say, constellation of bases across North America and around the world. It was the Western Defense Command Center, was responsible for all 17 western states of the United States, and the United States occupied Polynesian Kingdom of Atui, otherwise known as the Kingdom of Hawaii, made a state by force well after the Second World War, and of course under conditions that are so iffy that the United States government, its Congress in particular, formally issued an apology for its statehood. So its statehood remains open to question and is part of the story of what we'll be talking about. As a matter of fact, it is on the American-occupied territory of Hawaii, now forcibly a state, but really an occupied kingdom, that we had a form of subspecies that is very mysterious, known as the Menehune. And the Menehune were a very small, pygmy, perhaps fairy race that occupied much of Hawaii, and basically among the islands they were sighted normally by many islanders, and they might have been the Polynesian or the Oceanian version in the Pacific of what the fairy folk were throughout Europe. And the fairy folk have been concluded by some anthropologists who were consulted by the military in its occupation of Europe as being an anthropological or anthropologically recognized subspecies of a race of sentience, sentient, self-aware beings that was exterminated by the massive waves of migration into Northern Europe that found their presence to be intolerable. And since that time, myth, as you say, has taken over, and it's common wisdom, if we could call it that, or at least common impression, that the fairy folk escaped, those that escaped genocide and extermination, into literally another dimension, and that they've hated humanity ever since. They view humanity, of course, as a bane upon the earth, and there are many concepts of the fairy folk. There's the concept of the Seelie court and the unseelie court, and people, of course, simplistically, with their background in a kind of simplistic or degraded Christianity in the United States, will think of this as like good fairies and bad fairies. But that's really not the case at all. The way people in Europe would perceive it, who have a solid grounding in their folklore, would perceive it, they would perceive all of these fairies as hating humanity, and it would be gradations of bad to worse in terms of how they would respond or treat a human being. Now, Jacques Vallée, who's a fellow San Francisco Strandé, lives in San Francisco's Greater Bay Area with myself. I've met him more than a few times, spoken with him personally, had the honor of that. And he's an individual who first wrote about the fairy folk as being the precursors to modern or postmodern ufological cosmology in terms of their impact on humanity and their interaction with humanity. He first wrote of this in the book Passport to Magonia. And within Passport to Magonia, he spoke of the similarity between abductions by fairy folk, missing time, people who were transported from one place to another, and basically experiencing much of what we attribute today to alien abduction. And so he had the feeling that perhaps many abductees or experiencers in the postmodern age are experiencing something that's been parallel to human experience for thousands of years, if not millions, yet we're only interpreting it with a technological filter. The fact that the grays or the aliens are considered so much smaller is often something that is attributed to the fairy folk. People often, back in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, felt that they could blame the fairy folk for what medical anthropologists, and we'll use that term a few more times as this discussion goes on, medical anthropologists would say that many people during the Dark Ages who had children who suffered from progeria or the various kinds of hydroencephalitis or water on the brain, microencephalopathy or the small-brained peoples. They would feel that people who had these, who had sired children with these birth defects would blame it on the fairy folk and say that their child was a changeling, that somehow the fairies had stolen their real child and left this being to replace it with who didn't fit in perfectly with interacting in the human world. So this changeling concept is something that might parallel the modern ufological abductions and the experience of false pregnancies. So many medical anthropologists who have been studying this have kind of come up with what seemed to be a rational or skeptical impression of fairy interaction with the human world. But there's another angle to this. What about hybridization? Obviously, if the fairy folk are abducting human children, if this were true, something reported with primates like the smaller Homo floresiensis, also known as the Hobbit, that has been identified as an actual subspecies of non-human hominid that did indeed exist and may still very well exist because it's off-spotted in Malaysia and the Malayan cultural realm of the Indonesian archipelago, the largest island archipelago in the world. Certainly with their abduction of children, as the Indonesians often say that they do, they'll come out of the forest, abduct humans, take them there. There has to be some degree of raising of children in these foreign, we'll call them cultures, of fairy folk or hobbit folk, and eventually, one would assume, hybridization. Now, this would allow for a certain degree of infiltration, perhaps by hybrids, and if indeed they're working very heavily in the astral or in the dream time, as shamans would say, or people who work with that kind of remote invasion of other people's psyche, a kind of remote projection as opposed to remote viewing. If this is ongoing between humans and hobbits or humans and fairies, then what people would see would be a distortion of what these beings really look like. And that would add some credence to what Jacques Vallée has been expressing or did express a long time ago. And with that in mind, of course, we can go into my own personal experiences with the Chochoa and, of course, the cultural aspect behind that. I think we'll do that after I talk about what happened in Southwest Asia first, what Americans call the Middle East. And that had to do with a subspecies of human, or perhaps a non-human species of sentience, that the Arabic peoples and the Arab-speaking peoples and many other cultures in that region of the world, all the way from North Africa through Asia, refer to as al-Ghul, or the Ghoul. And the incredible thing about them was that they were first reported in an entirely ignorant fashion by that great, shall we say, urban legendeer, or shall we say, spreader of urban myths, Art Bell. And Art Bell had a report years ago on air in which he talked about naked people dancing in the desert in Iraq after the Gulf War that I had participated in, Gulf War II. Gulf War I, of course, being Iran versus Iraq. And in Gulf War, that lasted for 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. Well over 1 million people died on each side. That's a lot of bodies. That's a lot of dead. That's a lot of food for the ghouls. Now, then, of course, Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm took place, 1990, 1991. We had a 44-day atomic war. This was nothing less than an all-out thermonuclear attack using depleted uranium, thousands and thousands of rounds that, when they were combusted, resulted in so much nuclear dust that with their continued use in that area of the world, Iraq has suffered the radioactive exposure from depleted uranium remnants and combustible particulate, shall we say, detritus that it's the same as if it had been nuked with 44,000 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs. That is how awful that this pulverizing type of round was, and it was deployed all the way from its use in various kinds of rounds from that were fired from airplanes, mortars, tanks, etc. Mostly supposedly to take out vehicles because it could go through them like a hot knife through butter. And but beyond that, of course, it left an enormous amount of dead bodies. Now, none of these were ever really disposed of in a proper or hygienic fashion, and of course,
They were left to rot in the desert.
yes, many of them were. And what did people see after that? In the aftermath of that war, Iraq still stood for another 10, 20 years. Saddam Hussein declared a great victory because he was still in power and maintained his state for quite some time before the second invasion by Bush Jr. That's why a lot of Americans know about this sort of conflict in the Middle East, as they call it, as Bush War I and Bush War II. But when Bush Jr. invaded and destabilized and ultimately overthrew the Saddam Hussein regime, that was so much later that there had been people growing up all their lives who had never known about Gulf War I or Gulf War II. And so while he was in power for that period of time, the Iraqis who were driving through the desert experienced sightings of many naked people dancing in the desert that were identified by Western journalists or Western witnesses. Because when the Saddam Hussein regime still stood, it allowed journalists from England and other nations into Iraq. And witnesses to these events thought that they were ghosts of people who had died in the conflict. But the reality was they were something much more solid. And with all the bodies that had been left over, the ghouls fed until they were fat. And they were likely dancing off the calories. Quite honestly, the ghouls are famous for dancing at night to keep themselves warm by people who are familiar with that phenomena in Southwest Asia. But you had a situation, of course, from a distance. The drivers would see what would appear to be a normal human wrapped in very loose robes and a headdress common to the desert. But as the car would get closer and closer to these dancers in the desert, they would see the true nature become evident of what would be loose flabs of flesh. And these ghouls would be dancing in the moonlight, and the flesh would be hanging loosely from the wiring frame and off of their skeletal and gaunt kind of basic framework. Their flesh would flap and blow in the desert as if it were loose cloth. And they would appear, of course, to be quite emaciated and feeble. Of course, they were remarkably strong for their build. But as your car or SUV, mostly in those areas of the world, would pass right by them and they would look in through the windshield, you could see that their flesh on their face was drawn tight across their bare skulls. It would often even show signs of tearing when they'd been unable to feed for more than a few months or something of that sort. Now, you would think, of course, they'd been well fed after everything that I talked about, but obviously that kind of food goes very, very quick. And then you have a lot of probably what was a population explosion amongst their kind that left many more hungry, dancing at night when it gets very cold. The temperature can drop to incredibly low degrees in the desert at night. Then they're moving in order to maintain body warmth and perhaps even to, as I said, shake off calories depending on whether they fed or not. We're never going to know exactly because no one has authorized or funded formal study of these kinds of subspecies because the Westerners deny their existence completely, and the Southwest Asians just take them, many of them, as a fact of life and never bother or even care to do research into these kinds of creatures. And who would want to? How could you when you pass by in your car at night and you see the most frightening features of their faces, which are their gray eyes, nothing more than orbs, glowing with a vapid, dull white light, and they seem to be alive and full of spite. I know because I've seen them. And yeah, many of these people have seen them watching from the darkness of a desert night, and they'll assume that they belong to some kind of nocturnal predator and not realize it's something like this that crawls on all fours to give just that appearance, as my squad found out. So when we did find out about him, it was prior to Desert Storm itself. It was during the time of Desert Shield. And basically during that period of time when we were amassing for 9 months, like childbirth, all of our forces in the House of Saud, run by this degenerate Saudi dynasty, not the rightful heirs to the guardianship of the most holy sites of Islam, Al-Makkah and Al-Madinah, which belongs rightfully to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad himself, which are the Hashimi dynasty, which was overthrown by the British and now resides in Jordan. But His Highness the King of Jordan, of course, is in another part of Southwest Asia, directly bordering Israel at this point in history. And the House of Saud runs the majority of the peninsula and guards the two holiest sites of Islam. Now, they did something out of desperation during the pending war with Iraq, because Iraq had invaded the independent state of Kuwait. And this was because Kuwait had been slant drilling, stealing oil. Saddam Hussein had made his complaints known to the world, and he finally acted. Then the Americans, of course, prepared to counter-invade, and they spent forever accumulating the largest gathering of United States Marines in the history of the Marine Corps, far larger than any group of Marines that had been deployed with the Expeditionary Forces in Biala Wood in World War I or in Okinawa in World War II. So we were gathering all of these Marines, and we had as many as about 500,000 men eventually participating in Operation Desert Shield. And something else was brought that was considered far more important than the 500,000 men and the 50,000 women, about 41,000 at least, and that was the dogs. There were 35,000 dogs that were brought in country, and these were early detectors of biological and chemical weapons, and we were told they could have eliminated our cumbersome need for mop gear, or the chemical warfare rubbers that we had to wear covering ourselves, charcoal-lined rubber suits that made your life not only a living hell, but likely would have killed you if you had worn them for longer than 15 or 20 minutes, because you would lose as many pounds of body weight, water weight, in that same period of time, and literally dehydrate yourself to death keeping your hood on with those horrid suits. So we had a lot that we were dealing with, but the dogs proved useless, and we ultimately had to wear our mop gear anyway. And nobody could explain why the dogs were so useless, why they were so terrified, why they were useless. And it gives you an idea of why, in the Islamic culture, they look on dogs as worthless. They look on them the same way they look at pigs. Of course, the Semitic people do not eat pork. They view the pigs to be filthy animals, dirty, and that's because pigs don't sweat. Pigs don't sweat as mammals, and therefore they steal all the water. In order for a wealthy man to raise a couple of pigs, he'd have to be spraying them with water multiple times a day, chronically, to keep them alive. That's water that could go to keep an entire village sustained. Entire families would die for the want of water because of wealthy people raising pigs until the time of Muhammad. Therefore, for economic reasons, survival reasons, pigs were declared to be unclean. They viewed dogs pretty much the same way, not as man's best friend, but as a kind of rat of the desert, because dogs are useless to Muslims. Why? Because the dogs are afraid of the ghouls, and the ghouls turn all of their ability to work well with man off. And so that's what was going on in the desert. None of us, of course, who were from European culture matrix could understand what was going on. But all of that was an exercise in futility that became most apparent when we had the loss of a supply column of Saudi troops. Now, the House of Saud was allied with us, of course, and suddenly, during all of the war games, during the 9 months we were preparing to reinvade Kuwait, to retake it, Saudi supply column was classified as missing in action while crossing the desert on night maneuvers. So eventually, they called in many Americans to help try and locate it. And of course, my squad was one of those that got called in amongst the scanning of the desert sands. And it's very important to remember that when you're in the desert, you're either going to find somebody or something, or you don't, because these things are wide in the open, you would think, because you'd think they'd be spotted by satellite reconnaissance, even aerial reconnaissance, long before a human would step foot anywhere near them. That's not the case. The sands, they move like water, and they cover entire armies at night. If the armies stopped moving, and if everybody suddenly died due to a gas attack, their bodies could disappear under shifting sands and not be found for hundreds of years, at which point they'd be desiccated or mummified. So we had assumed that was what was going to happen to the supply column, which was armored, by the way, a lot of armored vehicles in it. But we were one of the long-range patrols that ultimately, when we were sent to go scanning for it, found it just by accident, or the remains of it. We found the vehicles. And the vehicles were wrecked trucks, jeeps. They were in a low valley in the central position of the Sinai. The weapons belonging to the soldiers were strewn all over the ground. Everybody had an empty magazine. All the men had apparently fired into the desert around them in all directions. And none of the bodies were there. There was nobody there. We found scraps of uniform, all the spent cartridges, and of course we were told to go on searching, as well as many other people who joined in the hunt. And finally, again, my squad had the great misfortune, if you will, of encountering the remains. They were 44 miles away, if you can imagine that. 80 kilometers. We use clicks, or international measurements, the metric system in the military, because everybody else in the world does.
How big was the convoy?
Oh, the convoy was fairly large. We're talking about scores of vehicles. It was we're talking about
50, 60,
2,000.
80, 2,000?
No, about 2,000. About 2,000 vehicles. 24. That's large. That's enormous. That's a lot of fuel. That's a lot of men. That's a lot of manpower. Well, from the location of mostly what were supply trucks, nevertheless all armored and accompanied by armored fighting vehicles, not tanks, mind you. Not that
like
might
the
have
Bradley fighting vehicles they gave to the Souths.
Like that, which were useless and proved themselves quite useless in that environment. Thank you, and were infamous for not working at all. I could go into that for hours. There's no point. People get my message and they get yours. But at any rate, we found the bodies, what was left of them, of the men, in a small depression 80 kilometers away, or clicks as we used to call it. Their uniforms had been torn away. That's why we found all the scraps on site. And these bodies were just bones. They were entirely stripped of flesh. And they weren't just bones, they were bits and pieces of bones. In other words, the bones were gnawed upon, broken open, the marrow sucked out. Very few remains of what you would call a coherent skeleton. Some of them were, and those that were more coherent looked like Halloween props. It's the first thing that would come to one's mind, but the flesh was stripped off of them. And but oftentimes, as I said, with the bones broken and whatnot, the only thing I could think of was what, I didn't know how to interpret it at the time. But what I thought of later was when I was a mercenary in East Africa, that's how hyenas would leave bones of their prey. Hyenas, by the way, will swallow bones entirely and regurgitate them whole. That way they get the meat off of them with their digestive juices and then vomit out the bone, which they don't need. They don't crack it open to take the marrow, though. But the bone, because of the digestive juices, will often have holes drilled right through it or burned right through it, because digestive acid is extremely powerful. It'll burn through the floor. That's why people get ulcers. And that's why it eats through the stomach lining, and why you have to use Milax or get surgery to restitch your stomach if your ulcers are bad enough. Now, in the case of what I saw, it was something that I would recognize later in East Africa as looking very similar to what a hyena would do. Of course, there's no hyenas in the Arabian Peninsula. There's no hyenas in Southwest Asia. They're strictly an African phenomenon. So what happened here was also different. Like I said, bones were literally cracked open and the marrow sucked out, something which hyenas can't do because they don't have hands or opposable thumbs, or the teeth that are necessarily appropriate through that, though of course they can bite through bone, but they don't usually intentionally do that with the swallowing and regurgitation technique that they have. But in terms of the bodies, there was no evidence that could identify, as far as I could see, the identity of any attackers. It didn't look like anything, obviously, the Iraqis would have had the time, the energy, or the proclivity to have done.
It looked like an animal's feeding nest ground. to you?
Well, kind of like that, but the fact was that this was nothing that I had ever seen in terms of an animal in the
Yeah,
desert
yeah,
on that large a scale. That was just ridiculous. That would be like something that would accumulate maybe over years,
yeah.
generations. This was like something that, for all intents and purposes, must have taken place overnight. Well, we could only wait for the police to show up, and in the House of South, there's only a few respectable kinds of professions. One of them is, of course, the police forces. Everything else in the House of Saud is pretty much you're either a member of the royal family or you're on the dole. Now, dole over in the House of Saud is nothing like here in the United States. We're not talking like a few $1,000s a month that can barely keep you alive. We're talking, 6, 7 figures for dole in the House of Saud because of the oil money. There's no jobs to employ anybody in. The overwhelming majority of jobs in the House of Saud are held by foreigners. The overwhelming majority of the population of the House of Saud is foreigners. Filipino servants, Korean doctors and nurses, people who are hired from all over the world to work in the airports. Almost nobody who is Saudi has a job or needs to have a job, either with the royals
An
or
infrastructure of service.
yes, yeah, and other people serving you. That's how it works there. But one of the few places where you have nothing but Saudis working would be in their military and their police forces. So the police forces were very respectable as far as Saudi citizens would go. There are people who had worked and seen a lot during their life, and a lot of what they work with is abandoned vehicles or forcing people to abandon vehicles. To give this some example to you, it's so hot in places like Egypt, Saudi Arabia. If you were silly enough to wear sneakers or even your normal type of combat boot, it would melt on your feet. It would burn your skin. This is how hot it is over there. The rubber on the sneaker soles would melt off in a matter of minutes. People dry clothes. They don't have dryers. They don't need dryers in the House of Saud. You just take your clothes out of the washer and they dry. Try and think about that. Try to imagine that for a minute. There's no point in polishing your boots because the polish melts off. It's just a nightmare scenario. So what is it that people do in their cars? They have to have air conditioning. It is law. It is law to have air conditioning. If you are caught and your car does not have an air conditioner, you will be arrested. You will be fined. You will be forced to abandon your vehicle because you're maintaining that vehicle or driving it without air conditioning means you could die. You are risking the lives of your passengers, particularly if you have passengers. And all of the police who enforce this over there, they're not like in the United States. They carry machine guns. So these are just normal police, not just the investigators or the inspectors who we had to deal with who came to observe the bodies. But that's just your normal beat cop, so to speak, or their version of highway patrol. And so what happens is oftentimes because of the sand, the grit that gets into the air conditioning system, it'll fail. So what do people do? With all the money they make, whether you're a royal or whether you're on the dole, you have so much money, your car is meaningless. It's just like something you abandon. So what people will do is when the police stop them and say, you got to abandon this car, your air conditioner is too full of grit to work properly, get out of it now, and you call a cab to get you and your passengers home, and then you can buy a new car tomorrow. And that's what people do. So they leave abandoned vehicles, SUVs, that, except for their air conditioners, are in mint, cherry, pristine condition, and the desert air and aridity keeps them that way for ages, years and years. So if anyone could think of a smuggling operation to penetrate the borders of Saudi Arabia and steal thousands and thousands of abandoned SUVs which line the roads in many desert areas, they would make a killing off of just fixing the air conditioner and putting it back on the market. But they're so wealthy over there, they abandon these cars, leave them on the side of the road. Now, all this is very important because this went into what the detective, the inspector, was telling us about when he came with his crew and they began to take DNA samples of the bodies, which is all they could do. There was no other method of identifier. They had to actually scrape the bones for DNA samples. They had to pack them. They had to make certain that the right bones were with the right bones if they could at all possible. Then they could take them back to the lab and then identify who was who for their loved ones. But we're talking about several hundred men that were killed in this fashion in an entirely unclassifiable incident that was not at all involved with military action. So what exactly did happen? So when I talked to the detective, there was nothing else to do. We had to be there for several days, well over 48.
The flies must have been horrible.
I'm sorry?
The flies must have been horrible.
What flies? There was no meat.
There was no meat? Nothing. Okay.
Yeah,
Just
the
the bones.
bones. The bones had been stripped, and so we basically would be there, camped out during the darkness of the night, and then, of course, acting as a kind of security provided by the United States to help with the police in that effort, cooperating with them for reasons of diplomacy. And of course, when during that period of time, I had multiple opportunities to speak with the detective, and he was telling me that he had seen things like this before, but never like this. And he said that basically this was obviously a situation in which the ghoul had attacked. And he explained to me what he knew about them. He said that basically the origin of the ghoul was a mystery, that there were several legends, of course, but they tell mostly of hidden tombs and temples in the deserts of all over Southwest Asia, many of them older than the pyramids in Egypt and South America. And these temples and tombs throughout Southwest Asia were places of power that were...
Places the jinn roamed, or the ghoul would be at.
That's right. They were dedicated to humanity's earliest deities as well, as what the legend would say. And basically, what would happen was that the ghoul were the servitor race of many of these ancient gods. Once man and ghoul worshipped the same deities together. But the humans, of course, later bowed to a new god. And the ghouls had hated them ever since. And so it's basically a kind of situation in which there was an ongoing race war, but the ghouls had always needed humanity because they fed off of its dead. And they protected these unholy places. Even after the last of the human worshippers had long since died, they were basically the guardians of these places because they were places of worship for the ghouls, a place of spiritual importance. And so we've got this necrophagic species that apparently has some kind of sentient or spiritual dedication to place names and spots that are important to them. And that's what the detective had said brought about the death of this supply column. He said basically what would happen was that many of these people who suddenly run across one of these tombs that's uncovered by the sands that shift after thousands of years will feel this overwhelming compulsion of greed. They'll venture inside the site, especially if you had a supply column full of military men who were fully armed and thought they had the wherewithal to deal with any challenges. Their minds would have been filled with images of jewels and gold, and basically they would have broken open into the crypt or the mausoleum or the tomb and tried to recover it for their own enrichment. And but of course, in this case, the ghoul came down upon them. And he said they fools probably fired in all directions, thinking they would hit somebody who was approaching them in the night on two legs. But the ghouls don't attack like that. They attack on all fours in packs. And he said most of the time he would see late at night a family that had been devoured like this because their SUV broke down in the desert in the middle of the night, or their air conditioner broke down and they all expired by basically dehydrating to death before they reached their destination. The ghouls would break open the parts of the vehicle just like bears would to get at your picnic basket in the United States. They'd take the bodies out and then clean them off, scour them to the bone. That's how he had seen it all his life with various families that had disappeared. But this was a case in which something different had gone on. He said there must have been a raiding of the crypt, and then the ghouls basically fell upon the military men and slaughtered them all, and then took their bodies miles away to make certain there was no evidence that could be traced back to the temple or the tomb, which they had covered up with the sands once again. So we've got a situation in which this kind of species of humanity exists throughout North Africa, deep into Central Asia, and no one, of course, has ever taken a census of it. They infest areas as far west as the Nile Valley, from what the detective told me, and the Sahara Desert. And, of course, he figured the total ghoul population of the Middle East would be unknown, but he figured they must be in the millions. And human incursions into the desert, he said, over the last 40 years, due to oil development, resulted in more and more ghoul tombs and temples being disturbed, and they're becoming much more active. And the recent night maneuvers that we had experienced in Operation Desert Shield, preparing to retake Kuwait, had stirred them up and angered them, and they were on the warpath. Now, I'm certain many more of them had come out to disturb people after we had done the damage we had did and left the highway of death, loaded with wrecked military vehicles, escaping civilians and civilian vehicles, all these thousands of dead bodies that they must have come and scavenged from. And so that after that, you had their sightings become regular overnight with their dancing in the desert that Art Bell had reported on in his total ignorance. But it's a dancing that the dervishes had been familiar with. This is what the whirling dervishes, or the Sufi order of such, had learned their dancing from, was from the ghouls in the desert in the darkness of the night. And so we have this cultural tradition of that kind of backing. And I was running into this kind of phenomena again when I was a mercenary in Africa. And of course, over there were African natives, people who had shown me the bones or the skulls of ghouls that they would never normally show to any white man. And they said the problem is, when they had shown them in the past to people who were looking for human remains, anthropologists, they were told to go F off because the anthropologists were looking for primates who basically would satisfy their own theories of evolution and what they thought a primitive human should look like, or a proto-human. Now, the ghoul's skull doesn't look like that. It looks more like that of a hyena's. It looks far more canine than it looks human. And so scientists would dismiss Africans who brought these ghoul skulls to them, saying, don't bring me the skulls of animals. Finally, Africans just stopped bringing them anything. So you have this whole phenomena of dismissal that has gone on for generations. Africa, of course, is a very, very different place. Everything operates differently. And anybody who thinks that scientific expeditions must have gone there and why haven't they discovered this new species of humanity, especially with what I'm going to tell you, what the Africans say about it, you would think that, oh, well, scientists from the West should have discovered all of this. You know, let me put that into some perspective for you. We've got 100 cultures in conflict in Africa. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world, all over the continent. It is entirely unmapped and unexplored in the majority. In 1890, there was not a single African language that had the word for wheel, because no one had ever seen one. And the first professional hunting safari didn't leave Nairobi until the year before Ronald Reagan was born. John F. Kennedy had just started shaving by the time a specially provisioned car became the first vehicle to ever cross the Saharan desert. And it was about the time that Elvis Presley was recording Heartbreak Hotel that we had only one sub-Saharan country. Today, of course, there's over 40 of them, maybe half 100, that had achieved independence. So we've got this total ignorance of an entire continent. By the time that I was there, serving as a mercenary, 1991, we were still having incidents like what I had run into, where over 15,000 members of the Dinka tribe of Somalia were sold into slavery, most of them winding up in Ethiopia. I've gone into that incident on air before. I don't want to relive that horror right now, but I can tell you that when I was in Sudan, they still had the legal custom of Sharia, of course, which is more and more known in the Western vernacular because of Sharia law. And that, of course, was in full effect. And a murder victim's family could choose the murderer's punishment. Now, when I was there in 1990, I saw both crucifixion and people boiled alive in oil that were chosen and lawfully administered. So we have a situation, of course, where your entire vision of reality is incredibly different from anything you would encounter in the West. And anyone who doubts that, think back about what I've said multiple times about Idi Amin Dada, who erected the statue of Adolf Hitler in his capital of Kinshasa. He, God, I have to ask my executive producer because of the two African nations that I was visiting, I keep getting their capitals confused after all these years. But I do believe Uganda's was either Kinshasa or Kampala, one or the other, and she usually corrects me on that. So I thank her for it, because without her, my memory would entirely collapse into a kind of senescence. But of course, when I was in his capital and saw that statue of Adolf Hitler, he was someone who was viewed as a villain by most of the West because of his fascist inclinations. He'd killed 300,000 of his countrymen. He dismembered some of his wives. But he's known as a hero to the Ugandans because his two successors, Dr. Obote and General Okello, killed far more of their fellow Ugandans than Idi Amin Dada ever did. So he was looked on as a just ruler. Now, of course, you've also got the problem of female circumcision. And it was Kampala was the capital of Uganda. Thank you, dear lady. Without her, all the marbles in my fishbowl of a brain would have fallen scattered out long time ago through the cracks. But of course, we've got the female circumcision, clitoridectomy. That's a ritual that's undergone by almost 80% of all adolescent Black African women living in those 40-plus nations south of the Sahara that I had been talking about. But probably worst of all, just to give people an idea of what Africa is really all about, very close to Uganda, we had the Central African Republic. And when I went in there, Emperor Bokassa had killed over 100 impoverished school children personally, face-to-face, in a single line. He lined them up and murdered them all with a fully automatic machine gun. Because they didn't have enough money to buy the school uniforms he insisted that they wear, which were made in his own factory. So we have a situation where human life is beyond cheap. And to give you even one more hint of this, Swahili is the lingua franca spoken all over East Africa. It is what your executive commander-in-chief, the man who claims to be your president, even though he has no birth certificate, he's a U.S. citizen, Barack Hussein Obama, his relation, the people he was born into, his family hails from Kenya, they all speak Swahili. And think about this and think about your president. In the Swahili language, there's not a word for woman. There's no such thing as woman in Swahili. The closest word they have for woman is manamuki. And that simply means female property. That describes human woman, mares, sows, ewes, female sheep, pigs, and human woman. It's just some kind of feminine property that a man can own or trade. And this is how they view women throughout Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, parts of Zambia, in the language of Swahili. That's your president's roots, and that's the man who leads you now. Now, out of Africa, of course, we had this situation of all this death and a lot of feasting, a lot of disappearances, no one keeping track of who's going where in any general sense, and therefore much could have been done by the ghouls. And it's in the continent of Africa, underneath Africa, from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco across the Sahara into the Rift Valley, perhaps as far south as South Africa and the Cape. There were, I was told, a series of interconnected tunnels, caves, subterranean rivers, massive lakes, most importantly, the largest kingdom of ghouls found anywhere on Earth. The most civilized on Earth, if you could call them that. Organized, disciplined, hierarchical.
Sentient with technology.
Well, not technology necessarily, but at least cultured. Okay. And their artwork, which is normally not any part of ghoul society that one thinks of in Southwest Asia or into Central Asia, because such artwork would lead to clues, would lead to genocide, because humanity has always worked to exterminate the ghouls. Since the dawn of history, ghouls have been hunted by humanity.
Just like you said, the fairy people were hunted to humanity or outbred throughout Northern Europe.
Yes, and as a result, the ghouls have created an anti-culture in most parts of the world. No literature, no art. Such artifacts might provide clues about their methods and hiding places to other races.
Sticking with the oral traditions.
That's correct. They don't not only dance, they also sing sibilant hisses, soft songs that humans would find bone-chilling. And, of course, the carrion eaters who prefer their meat well-aged. They usually take it fresh when something has died or becomes easy prey. But that's normally not what they go for. That's where the grave robbing comes in. So we have this situation, as I said, where you've got this kind of fugitive culture in most of the world. But in Africa, where humanity dies like flies, that is where they thrive and have been able to establish a culture in which they could develop art, twisted and grotesque as it is, that adorns and decorates their world. Their eating of human flesh might be savage, but they have taken to breeding their food for future needs. And apparently they have an apocalyptic view of an end time to come in which they'll need all the meat that they can get. So when I was told by many Africans that much of the art that is so inhuman looking, so futurist looking, so different to human eyes. People take a look at African art and it looks uncannily futurist, almost abstract. And they take a look at some of the figures that look so incredibly inhuman. Many Africans pointed out that this was inspired by artwork of the Ghouls and based on other terrible races under the earth that they themselves dealt with while they were stockpiling humans. Africans would tell me that humans have been disappearing for generations by the hundreds at any given time during a year. That could be noted by various villages or tribes. And they said that over millennia, tens of millions of humans have been stockpiled and bred like cattle deep beneath the earth in these huge caves that are ruled by the Ghouls. And, of course, that's something that any Western scientists, if brought to their attention, would dismiss. They would say it was sheer fantasy, and therefore no investigations are done. I mean, what are you going to do about a people who the Africans have been bringing skulls to for generations that are dismissed as some kind of larger-headed canine or something like that, as opposed to being some kind of differentiated human species? If you don't have a paradigm which will accept the existence of something, you're not going to ever find out about that something which does exist. So that's the hideous.
It'll be continue to be a myth, and the archaeologists will continue on and on and on and continue to ignore what's right in their face.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened. I can tell you by what was shown to me in terms of a skull, it very definitely was something that was chilling to look at. It was definitely a brain cavity. I can tell you this, having seen enough human skulls in my life as a mercenary, and in many of the areas that I've been in where many people's bodies were rotting openly, I've seen enough to see what a brain cavity looked like. And the brain cavity of the skull that I was handed, that was told belonged to Al Ghul, was equal, if not larger, than those found in humans. They must be as intelligent or more intelligent in their own way than modern day humans. And certainly very large eye sockets. The creature was nocturnal, and it either hunted during the night or lived underground. That was very much obvious. The skull was thicker than that of a human, far more tolerant to injury, obviously, than what would be characteristic of even Neanderthal man. And it had a very thick snout, suggested his jaw would be very strong, capable of tearing through flesh and bone. But definitely, I can tell you, my squad, when we were in Southwest Asia, after our encounter in terms of that pit of bones that had been produced by the Ghoul in that one mass assault, my squad was useless for the rest of the war. They were so chicken dip at any sight of what was following us at night that they couldn't even take a crap alone. They had to have someone escort them, pointing their gun out in the darkness. And, of course, I had instructed them, fire low. Fire at anything low that comes in. And, of course, it's like a Claymore mine. Point face towards the enemy while you're taking a crap. And many of them were so scared they couldn't do it without waking up the entire squad. It was pathetic. But nevertheless, there was reason, perhaps. Certainly, we saw much more than was following us that should have been following us after that incident, and it followed us pretty much until the war began, and we were brought into the invasion of Kuwait. So that is something that really stuck in my mind, that these creatures would be basically very good at hunting and taking on a kind of assassination mentality. So definitely, I think that they are in their own right, not only sentient, but capable of memory, identification. Certainly, this is something that might have led in the past, as I was told by that Arab detective, to human and ghoul interaction and alliances. but these communities were always either by eccentrics who had been rejected by human society and therefore felt a kinship with the ghouls and would bring them bodies, help them in terms of hiding their communities, and or it would be communities that took to bringing out the bodies of the homeless or the criminals to keep the ghouls at bay so that the ghouls would not bother the bodies of their loved ones. Now, whenever such alliances, the detective told me, were discovered in the Arab world, then those communities themselves would be wiped out by other human beings because the humans hated the ghouls so much. But of course, he said that from what he understood, the ghouls had their own kind of myth and legend about their origins. He didn't know what, but when I was in Africa, I was told that there were interactions with the ghouls through human beings that had been allowed to leave the caverns where they were bred like animals. Many people, of course, throughout the Muslim world and the East African part of that continent is very Islamic, very Islamicized. Swahili is known as a Muslim language. The people such as the Somalis, some of the most beautiful people in the world, live in a highly Islamist region. So we have a very Islamic influence on pagan, animist, spiritual Africa. And in that part of the world, they've come to a conclusion that demons, which they believe in, and of course, it's a belief confirmed in by Islam. They believe that demons, like jinn, can be your friend. And they view demons as the perpetrators of retributive justice. So they don't view demons as evil, but as potential allies in the carrying out of retributive justice. That a demon, in that sense, may even be your friend. So with this very different kind of paradigm, the Africans, unsurprisingly, have stories of humans who have cooperated with the ghoul. And what they spoke of was that humans were allowed to leave the caverns where they bred humans for generations who had known nothing other than being cattle or chattel within the caverns of the ghouls. And they would allow some of them to leave after chewing off their face. And once they chewed their face off to make certain that these people could never interact with human society, the humans were allowed to leave because then they would go about in the Muslim tradition of covering their face with a headscarf and a face veil. And so these humans who were spies for the ghouls could go in amongst humanity in the Muslim world with their traditional covering of a face scarf, a hijab, and a kafia, and then return into the caves to report on their interactions, what they had found, so that ghouls were kept constantly abreast of what was going on in the surface world.
You were saying before the largest ghoul community would have been in the Morocco mountains. Is it fair to say that the King Solomon's mines would have been some form of interaction with the ghouls of those underground territories?
You know, that's a valid question. It's very legitimate. It's very interesting because we have the legends and the myths are the real history, if you will, from an occult sense, of King Solomon dealing with the demons and
Yes.
calling forth the demons. And I think that that was something that was real. He was dealing with the jinn and the demons in a true occult sense. And if he was dealing with the ghouls, I don't believe that that's necessarily what comes down to us through history. The ghoul probably would have been, I think, if he came from that cultural matrix, he would have been more than aware of them. He might have been participatory in attempts to exterminate them, but he would not necessarily have lowered or stooped himself to working with them, whereas the summoning of demons and the binding of demons would have proved his power to all of his followers, because
Right,
that
as
would
well
show
as the ghoul demons or whatever belief system they were trying to hijack then.
well, amongst the Africans, the impression that I get was that the ghoul were very pragmatic creatures, and that they themselves had, through spies that had come on the earth, the surface world, and interacted with other humans, and were discovered to have their faces eaten off, or perhaps discovered as spies by human communities and interrogated before they were killed. It seems that the ghouls themselves say that when the Creator was done with the creation of short-lived humans, that the Creator felt that these humans would be dying all over the place, and before long the whole world would be covered with dead humans. So he created the ghouls to take care of the mess. And they felt that their persecution at the hands of humanity was an insult to the Creator, and that someday the Creator would see that the humans would get theirs. someday. And so because of that, they have been stocking on humans and corralling them, herding them, breeding them as chattel animals for food for millennia in preparation for those end times. So that's the kind of cosmology of an entirely separate sentient species that is brought to us from the dry and arid deserts of the world. Now, of course, we're going to transition from that to other sentient species that, of course, I've dealt with during my lifetime, and kind of merge from that into the undersea species during this conversation. But Laura Lee Solomon, with what I brought up, does this ring any memories of yourself of what exactly you've been studying? Does anything that you have run into in all of your research, does any of this touch upon that?
No, sir, it does not.
Ah, well, definitely. We have many other people who have been basically getting much of their impression of these kinds of phenomena from popular culture. And popular culture, of course, is often conveyed through science fiction. And we know about Richard Shaver. And Richard Shaver wrote about a race called the D-Rows, or Deviant Robots is what he said their name was an acronym
The
for.
underground people, yes.
Yes, which live permanently underground. Now, obviously, I've spoken very much in the past. Nexus Magazine published a 3-part article amidst all the controversy and pain that I suffered through the ambush that was organized by Nexus Magazine, in which everything I had, basically, as a veteran who's basically a sedentary fugitive and lives out of his travel bag, very much the way a Secret Service agent would. An entire life of a field agent is usually in portable bags, such as the sea bag of a sailor or the kit bag of a soldier. And my profession required everything I had, including most of my prized possessions from the Gulf War, to be carried, and all of that was stolen in a Nexus Magazine ambush when they arranged for me to go down to Australia. And of course, Virgin Australia was the airlines that stole it, probably turned it over, of course, to American intelligence, and was very proud to say they stole it. They said they operated a theft ring for luggage that stole from people all the time. There was nothing I could do about it. If I sued them, I'd have to go back down to Australia to sue them in Australian courts because it was a Virgin Australia franchise. So that's the horror of the kind of life that I deal with, is dealing with these kinds of criminals. So, of course, I've never dealt with Nexus Magazine since for arranging that ambush, which later on they admittedly had done, and or Virgin Australia with, of course, Branson, the same individual who flies Dr. Stephen Greer all over the world without his luggage ever getting stolen because he spreads his claptrap and his propagandistic puke and pablum. But in my case, of course, obviously, I'm the enemy of the state. But one of the things that I spoke to Nexus Magazine about was Unterland, or the land below, because our world, of course, is not hollow. That's an obfuscation that's intentionally perpetrated with intent to discredit reality. Unterland is not the hollow earth, but the inner earth. You know, in 1992, my final year of service as a Department of Defense research librarian, it was finally released to the scientific community at large, not the general public, to which such news was essentially illegible, but to the scientific community, geo-paleo-ecologists and the like, meaning the people who study the ancient environment of the planet Earth. It was then made known to the majority of them that were outside of military defense contract that our planetary mantle, the deep layers of the Earth's structure, contained loads of water that entirely dwarf the existing oceans. There's water in the Earth's upper mantle, more water under the Earth than there is on the surface of the Earth, meaning all the waters of the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean combined are smaller in content than the waters that are beneath the surface of our Earth. And where there's water, there's life. And water is a corrosive, and it's corroded enormous caverns within the mantle, the crust of our Earth in particular. So when we speak of the tremendous hollows in the Earth, like I was speaking of with the ghoul, we're not talking deep, deep beneath the Earth. We're talking literally what is a comparatively small amount of space. It's within the rind of the Earth. If an orange were to be used as a comparison, all of these enormous caverns, these lakes, these subterranean rivers, where millions of people are supposedly kept, according to many Africans, beneath the surface of the earth and raised all their lives in the darkness as chattel for the ghouls that feast off them. All of this is within the rind of our planet, if it were comparable to an orange. And of course, in further reinforcement of this, around 2007, just about 7 years ago, two American scientists discovered, in evidence gleaned from seismic waves, an entire ocean beneath communist China's capital of Beijing, locked, they said, within porous rock. And that was the same year that Japanese scientists from Tokyo observed the dragging down of water at subduction zones, reported in June 8th of 2007 in the Science magazines. Now, water, of course, is something that, as I said, corrodes. The result was a single cavernous supersystem of lacunae many miles below our terrestrial surface. It spans the globe via a skein of megacavities throughout the Earth's upper crust, that's venously connected through a sunless subterranean ocean, the Sea of Valusia, that is, as it's known. And the supercavities comprise Unterland, the lands below. They're enormous, hundreds of miles long, usually at least a mile from floor to ceiling, allowing for weather by condensation that creates rain. So there's plenty of interterrestrial space to explore. And, of course, that's where the expansion of civilization has taken place since the exodus of much of the leadership and a great deal of population from the time of the Third Reich, which I spoke of in Nexus magazine in a 3-part article. Now, what's so important about this is that relocated thousand-year Reich has its own challenges, not with just establishing a frontier society, but also in dealing with the other sentient races that have been down there for millions of years before them. And that's where I came into records about the D-Row. What the Department of Defense was speaking of was an indigenous in various records when they had consulted people in Europe during the occupation, were consulted with anthropologists on contract to the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Command of Europe. Apparently, there was a Europoid relic population literally driven to ground. The supposedly mythical Dwegar that were painfully known to the Nordic peoples, the Scandinavians, the Vikings, and the Norsemen knew about the Dwegar, spelled D-U or D-W-U-E-G-A-R, different spellings for it depending on the phoneticization. But the Dwegar literally got twisted into D-Row. And the Dwegar were known as a cruel, twisted, and ironically, for an eventually subterranean species of sentient hominoid, swarthy dwarfen kind of humanoid, about 3 to 4 feet tall. And they were
the bitter enemies of the Dwarven Kingdom, too.
I believe so. Science fictionally represented by the tortured American artist Richard Sharpshaver, who died in 1975. He served inspiration to the American author Howard Phillips Lovecraft's horror story. Richard Upton Pickman, Pickman's model, wrote of something of a combination of in concept. And of course, Lovecraft died in 1937, but Richard Sharpshaver was born in 1907. So he was alive for the 37 years or about 30 years that Lovecraft was alive. There's no doubt that they had some intercourse in terms of information exchange, and I believe that it was, according to some of the records I was dealing with, American domestic intelligence, the FBI, which had been following both of these individuals, mainly because Howard Phillips Lovecraft had been contracted by the American hero Charles Augustus Lindbergh to write an American Mein Kampf, because Charles Augustus Lindbergh was running for the presidency on the fascist ticket. His sponsor was the multi-billionaire of his day, Henry Ford. And Henry Ford, of course, had received a medal, the highest civilian medal or honor ever distinguished upon a foreigner by the Third Reich. Henry Ford was the recipient of such for helping with the development of mass production in the Third Reich. And in terms of Henry Ford and his backing as the money man to Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who was the charismatic man, the face, the man who was the basically the heart and the looks of their operation, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was to be the brains. and he was working on the American Mein Kampf when he died quite suddenly. So we're told, of cancer. Now, in terms of following him, that was the rationale behind that, and the FBI documents kept upon him. The FBI also kept its eye on Richard Sharp Shaver because he was a full-blown member of the Communist Party. Now, both of these individuals had discourse and ideological arguments at some point, and it was Richard Sharp Shaver who gave the inspiration for the Lovecraft character Richard Upton Pickman of Pickman's Model. Now, American fans of the periodical Amazing Stories, a pulp fiction magazine, came to know of these dwarven Dwegar as Dero, and this was unimaginative, but it was something that was trying to portray soulless kinds of peoples or sentiencies that were sadistic, perverse, and twisted. And when they captured people, would keep them alive for as long as they could to keep them in pain for as long as they could. Now, this was doubtless rooted in centuries of festering resentment over being driven from the surface world by the successor population of European Norsemen. Now, the Dwegar have been concluded to dwell in both natural cave formations and clusters of intraterrestrial earthen hovels that are dispersed in an underpopulated interglobal arc from the central Siberian taiga through the northern polar wastelands about the Arctic Circle. Now, all of them were thought to have been eradicated in many areas of the world, such as the North American areas of Nunavut in Canada, by the Eskimo, or the indigenous populations of northern tribes. And these various kinds of shall I say, Dwegar, if they're in different tribes, which is probably inevitable. I'm certain that they have their own racial offshoots, were cited oftentimes in reports that were intercepted by the United States military. These reports usually sourced from, of all things, Soviet Spetsnazye or special purpose forces known as Spetsnaz. And the Spetsnaz was infamous for regularly infiltrating and patrolling Alaska and sabotaging pipelines, preparing the way for what might have been a potential Soviet invasion, but certainly doing nonstop reconnaissance. And these Spetskommandos would report back. Sometimes the reports were intercepted, but they spoke of what they called Dwergar, waving Novi Schmeissers, or some modern descendant of World War II era German machine pistols. And they said they had spotted Dwergar many times in their reports. The Americans would dismiss this. Most of the time they intercepted these reports from the Spetskommandos. They would say, oh, well, the Spets are giving us shit, that they're just basically passing out disinformation. Now, that didn't jive with other records that I dealt with, talking about the reality of the Dwergar. I think the Spetskommando were reporting what they saw. They said every once in a while on their trek through the forests in the undeveloped regions, of which there's many in Alaska, they would sometimes spot the Dwergar on the surface world, and, of course, the Dwergar would sometimes open fire on them. But it was by weapons that they said were like modernized World War II era, just German machine pistols. Now, presumably, the Unterlanders would
like
never
the German Mauser pistol, that kind of traditional imagery?
Yes, that sort of thing, which the Spetsnaz recognized, of course, from their history of deployment in World War II. Now, the Unterlanders, or the Third Reich in exile beneath the surface of the earth, would never suffer an alliance with their ancestral enemy that had been wiped off of the surface by their Nordic Aryan ancestors. And so, any more than their Teutonic Vorfahren, or forebearers, would tolerate the presence of the Dero, or the Dwergar. I'm certain that the Aryans interterrestrials, as the Americans refer to them as, would try and exterminate them or eradicate them. But so there must be an ongoing struggle between these races. And it's almost certain that these weapons were captured by the Dwergar, who probably don't have their own industrial base for development of such weapons and probably would never acquire them in trade. Those weapons would probably be either a trophy or even an objective for that particular genus of sapient in their conflicts with the Thousand-Year Reich in exile. But obviously, with all the challenges they have in the world below, the National Socialistische Reich as reestablished under the earth probably is devoting too much energy to that to ever mount an invasion of the surface world. So it is probable that that is not a threat to the surface world in its foreseeable future. But there's something else, of course, that's affiliated on the Asian side of the axis, what the Japanese have spoken of as the Hachurui, the serpent men. And the serpent men were often affiliated in Asiatic tradition with Valusia. Now, Valusia, of course, comes down to the West through, again, pulp literature authors such as Robert Irvin Howard, or even more recently, a friend of mine, David J. West, who writes such kinds of adventure fiction. And we have, in the case of many of these short stories and novels, the concept of Valusia as a kingdom furthest to the west of the Thurian continent, or the Turian continent, in the age of Earth's prehistory, created and ruled by the Hachuri, the serpent men, until they were overthrown by the human slaves. Now, the term Valusian can refer to either the Hachuri, the serpent men themselves, or the humans of Valusia. But when that huge underground ocean was found beneath Asia, the Beijing anomaly, it was instantly referred to as the Sea of Valusia, because, as was often stated, the hills of Atlantis and Mu were isles in the sea when Valusia was young. Now, per the occulted or secreted traditions of ancient mythography, rendered popularly accessible to Western man by the works of people like Robert Howard or David J. West, we basically know that the natives to this world, the serpent people, evolved in the early to mid-Permian from what has come down to us as myth, but what does come down to us as myth as well from Buddhist tradition and the cosmology of the Buddhists is that when they are described, they seem to identify basal diapsid reptilian stock. So that would mean the serpent men aren't really serpents at all, because true snakes wouldn't emerge for another 100 million years at the time that the Hachururi were said to exist. So they would be some other kind of reptilian or humanoid. And the reason that they're so important to Buddhism is because they were known as the Dragon Lords. And it was stated that the Dragon Lords could also find enlightenment. So this is a part of Buddhist doctrine that people can research on their own and find out that, according to Buddhist doctrine, that these Hachuri are capable of benevolence, enlightenment, conversion to Buddhism, and even ultimately attaining a bodhisattva status themselves, becoming living Buddhas. Now, otherwise, on a more negative sense, they were known as masters of chemical and psychological warfare, maybe tailed, certainly venomous, partially through deliberate eugenics, or the maintenance of certain dietary habits, but they manifested normally a culture of intrigues, largely based on an obsessive tension between trust and treachery, until the advent of Buddhism. And then some of them apparently became converts because they entered the Buddhist records. So we definitely have a concept of these Hachurui that will enter the discourse as I speak now of the Chochoa. Now, the Chochoa are something similar to the Diro, kind of like an Asiatic Dwegar. And the Chochoa exist traditionally or historically throughout all of Central Asia into East Asia. And the Chochoa are recognized by anthropologists as alive and well and having an official language. So if anybody looks up the term Chocho, TCHO-TCHO, they will find Chocho is a language recognized by academia as an anthropologically vetable language. It's real. There are people who speak Chocho. I have met them in San Francisco, tried to get them employed by the San Francisco Police Department as translators for the Chocho minority, But the San Francisco Police Department refuses to recognize the existence of the Cho-Cho, even though they're responsible for most of the opium smuggling throughout the greater San Francisco Bay Area region. So we've got this situation again of absolute denial of a reality. Now you might ask, why would they be in denial of this? What's going on with that? And mostly because I know this for a fact, having been in the San Francisco Police Department myself as a sworn enforcement agent of the law. In other words, I was an SFPD cop for a very short period of time before I was phased out with an injury. Namely, I went deaf in my right ear due to suffering chickenpox as an adult that was inflicted upon myself by a fellow cadet, an a-hole named Stephen Bartholomew. So here's a big F.U. to Stephen Bartholomew out there, who's now sitting pretty as a San Francisco County Sheriff. But at any rate, before I was phased out of SFPD, I was someone who knew how they operated, was working with them. That's when I was trying to get these Cho-Cho speakers to be taken in by the SFPD as translators. That's when I was informed by the SFPD administration that we can't recognize the Cho-Cho as even existing because the alphabet agencies, the FBI and the CIA, have told us they don't exist. So in other words, everyone on the street, as a beat cop, knows they exist or is somewhat aware of them or has some hint of their existence, or at least the veterans do. But most of them, when they get to a stage of awareness of it, realize they can never speak about it because it's something that is in the territory of the alphabet people, the FBI, CIA, the NSA, and all those people who they don't want around while they're doing their own work because it means more work for them whenever those people show up. But one might ask, well, how did this situation come to be? How did the Cho-Cho get here? What are they about? And what they're all about is, of course, a tribe of Southeast Asian, as they turn out to be these days, pygmies. Now, originally, they came from Central Asia. They came from what was known as the Leng Plateau in Tibet. They are a kind of Sherpa, very similar to this kind of guides that will help escort people up Mount Everest, whose entire society is based on escorting people up Mount Everest. That's pretty much their economy. Recently, they've tried to outlaw the overuse of them and the opening of Mount Everest to all these amateurs because of some terrible landslide that took place on Mount Everest that killed so many Sherpa at once, wiped out entire groups of men because of this kind of activity. But their distant relations would be the Cho-Cho. Now, the word Cho means black magician in Tibetan. The Tibetan language uses Cho as the very word for black magician. Now, there's a Cho chocolate based in San Francisco. Of course, it's moved its headquarters now. They operate out of Oakland, but it was originally in San Francisco where they maintained their administrative offices. And you can look this up yourself. It's easy for anyone to vet. And that word is so distinctive, black magician, for black magic chocolate. One might ask, well, what is all this? Do they have like little pygmies working in the chocolate factory like Keebler has elves or something? But no, it's a lot more sinister than that.
That's funny.
Yeah, what we have
Keebler's Cho-Choas.
Yeah, what we have is basically a race that claims that their god was Da Cho, which people can look up, and it's spelled D-A-T-C-H-O, D-A space T-C-H-O, and Da Cho is not pronounced in any way or shape or form as how it's spelled. It's pronounced Dabzog. And this is because, like the Celtic language, which is entirely unpronounceable and is pronounced in no way, shape, or form as how it's spelled, you have a situation in which the phoneticization has been a botch job. No one really knows how to speak many of these Celtic languages because there's no one left alive who wasn't exterminated to speak many of the subgroups of those languages. The Cho-Cho language is somewhat similar. My father was one of the last people on Earth to see the Cho-Cho communities in China because during the Second World War, they were all exterminated. That's why they're now identified as a Southeast Asian species of pygmy, or the subgroup of humanity if they're to be considered human, which most Asians don't consider them. So their god, Dabzog, is known as the death spirit. So when you talk to many people, like, say, for instance, Daniel Brinkley, who was in the U.S. Army Special Forces during the Second Indochina conflict, the Vietnam War, as the Americans call it, or the American War, as the Vietnamese call it, you have this individual who has seen a lot, and he's died himself a lot. And so when I spoke to Daniel Brinkley about Dab Sog, he instantly said, the Death Spirit. And of course, he's one of these men who was deep in the woods, deep out there in the bush. He knew about these cultures, and yet he thinks of it more as a supernatural phenomenon as opposed to a subgroup of humanity. Now, there were other men who knew a lot better, and these were men in high command or in intelligence, and they were men of low moral fiber and high intelligence, like Colonel Michael Aquino, the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. Now, when he was involved with military intelligence, he was U.S. Army Special Forces, just like Daniel Brinkley, only he was involved with PSYOPs. And because he was involved with PSYOPs, one of the purposes of Special Forces is force multiplication. Now, keep in mind, people have a totally different view of Green Berets, Special Forces today than they did back in the era of Vietnam. People think Rambo. People think go out and kill. Okay, that wasn't the case for the Special Forces back in the day. During the Vietnam conflict, that wasn't their job. The people who would go out and kill, the assassins of the battlefield, were the U.S. Army Black Berets, the United States Army's Rangers. So the Rangers were entirely different from U.S. Army Special Forces. The Green Berets, who were products of Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and the Green Berets were there as a very violent, armed, highly trained version of the Peace Corps. They were Kennedy's boys. It was Kennedy's baby, and Kennedy wanted a force multiplier that could take friendly populations behind enemy lines and convince them to fight on the side of the Americans against their communist occupiers. So that's why Special Forces...
The classic counterinsurgency.
Yes, that's why Special Forces was working with the Hmong tribesmen, the Montagnards, and all these various other native tribes throughout Southeast Asia. Well, one of the tribes the U.S. Army started working with was the Choctaw. Now, the Choctaw had migrated into Southeast Asia because they had been persecuted all the way from Tibet through China into finally Laos and Cambodia, where their last great population base was. Now, all of this is a known fact. And, of course, when my father was in China before Pearl Harbor, because my father had run away from home at the age of 16, he joined the Navy to get as far away from home as possible. They gave him his wish. He was sent to the China gunboat patrols in the Yangtze up the tributaries. He was definitely there at the time that World War II started between the Japanese and the Anglo-Americans, and that was in December 12th through the 13th of 1937, when the Japanese, in response to the Americans attacking the Japanese and Chinese peace negotiations at Nanking, bombed in retaliation His Majesty's ship, the Lady Bird, and the United States ship, the Pan A. And when these ships were sunk, World War II began on the mainland of China that very day, December 12th through the 13th in 1937, and my father was there to see it. One of the other things he saw in country was the Choctaw, and these were a group of pygmy sorcerers feared by all the Chinese, by all the Asians, because they could kill you in your sleep. And he said the horror of it was that they would demand money, they would demand sacrifices, and they would demand everything from the people in exchange for letting them live and not killing them in their sleep. And they would use opiates to enter the dream state, travel in the astral, and murder people in their sleep, just the way people in the Amazon, who are shamans, can use cocoa and various other drugs, psilocybin-type drugs, various kinds of purgatives or mushrooms, to go into the astral and visit each other in the dream state. So they can travel in a person's dreams, invade them in their sleep, their space, and kill them. Now, this existed for thousands of years in the state of terror until the Japanese showed up. Now, the Japanese are immune to the invasion of their sleep and dreams by the Choctaw because the Japanese are not Asian. The Japanese are the Caucasians of Asia. Their descendants come from, by their own mythology, the sunken continent of Mu, or Muvaya, and, of course, they are interbred quite heavily with the Ainu, who are all Caucasians, and the only pure Ainu are Caucasoid Japanese, live now on Hokkaido, the Sakhalinsk and Kursk island chains in northern Japan, And of course, they're viewed as kind of like the Native Americans or or Indians, if you will, of the frontier of the Japanese islands. Now, they are pure Caucasian, and that's anthropologically undeniable. The interbreeding of the Japanese with those people make the Japanese the hairiest Asians in all of East Asia. They're not viewed as Asian by any other Asian peoples. And of course, this is proven out in their genetic immunity to nocturnal attacks by the Chochoa. Now, because the Japanese were immune to the Chochoa attacks, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, people all over Asia allied and collaborated with the Japanese, and many of them begged in return that the Japanese exterminate the Chochoa. For that reason, the Chochoa were the only ethnic group in all of Asia that was signaled out specifically by the Japanese high command for total extermination. Now, people might say, well, that's horrible. No one deserves that. But take a look at what happened in Laos and Cambodia. The Satanist, Michael Aquino, said the Chocho are black magicians and they kill people in their sleep. We need to bring them back to the United States, and we can kill anyone all over the world in their sleep with these people. And that's when the CIA took over, which Aquino never forgot and never forgave. And Aquino used to tell me, someday I'm going to get back and get the Chochoa back under military command when I get my man in charge of the CIA. Later on, what happened was General Petraeus, for a very short period of time, an army general, took over the CIA, and the one thing he did was he transferred the oversight of the Chochoa communities in the North American continent back under Army responsibility. Now, people might be a bit confused and say, what are you talking about, Chocho in North America? How'd this happen? Well, the Vietnam War happened, and the Vietnam War stopped. And when the Vietnam War came to a crashing halt, and you had the withdrawal in 1973 and the final evacuation in 1975, you had all kinds of Vietnamese boat people who came to the United States by the tens of thousands. Now, of all of those immigrants, we remember many of them were people who had cooperated with the Americans to fight the communists, the Montagnards, the Hmong, all these Laotian tribes. And, of course, they were brought over, as far as the high command was concerned, simply as food for the Chochoa. Psychic chattel, cattle, for them to psychically feed off of through their attacks. Because in Laos, all of the Laotian Hmong tribesmen have a central pillar in their villages which they would sacrifice animals to. And they would sacrifice these animals and bleed them onto the blood column so that their ancestors would be fed and placated, and their ancestors would guard them in their sleep from the ravages of the Chochoa. When the Hmong and the Laotians were brought over to the United States, there was nothing in the cities, architecturally or otherwise, that would equate to a central pillar which they could make sacrifice unto to protect their communities. And I could hear them die in their sleep. When I grew up in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, now known as Little Saigon, that's like a Chinatown for the Vietnamese in San Francisco. I grew up in one of the largest ghetto complexes, known as El Cerrito Apartments. It still stands today. I believe it's 270 Turk Street. And on 270 Turk Street, where the El Cerrito apartment stands, it's one of the largest complexes, what the San Francisco Police Department used to call the compound in the entire Tenderloin ghetto, which was called the Tenderloin because the cops who cruised it got hazard pay and could afford tenderloin steak every night. So you've got this horrible situation in which the Laotian, the Hmong tribesmen were dumped out of Vietnam as the offal of war. They're trying to adapt to an entirely urban environment when they were all country people. I could hear them screaming in their sleep at night while they died because they were all suffering sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. Now, they claimed that they were visited by Da Cho, or what's spelled as Dabsog, D-A-B-T-S-O-G, and Da Cho was, of course, this horrible death spirit that was represented by its worshippers, the Chochoa. Now, we airlifted over 100,000 Hmong, Laotian, various other kinds of tribes, the Montagnards, to the United States, and with them, we imported 40,000 Chochoa into the United States and Canada. Now, you might say, how'd they pull that off? How could they do that without people recognizing who are all these pygmies? Well, that's quite easy. That was due to Operation Baby Lift. Operation Baby Lift happened when you had SPOVO, its original term, Support for Vietnamese Orphans, organized by all these American volunteer agencies who wanted to bring all of these Vietnamese orphans who were Amerasians, the products of black or American rape of Vietnamese prostitutes, created all of these half-breed hybrid kids that the communists were going to exterminate. So many churches said, we've got to bring them to the United States or they're all going to die. They'll be killed by the communists. So they had entire cargo planes that they were able to arrange to airlift thousands of babies back to the United States. So in April of 1975, with the fall of Saigon and the North Vietnamese army tearing up that entire area, the Presidio military base where I worked became the destination for at least 1,300 tiny refugees, infants, that came through Operation Baby Lift or SPOVO. Now, World Airways lifted them to California, and then military planes, cargo planes, were in assistance, and they would actually fill these military cargo planes with shoeboxes that they would put the infants in so they could carry hundreds in the plane at a time because they were desperate and the situation was urgent. The Presidio military base converted this entire drill center, this large hall known as Harmon Hall Reserve Center, into a nursery. And they brought in doctors, nurses, cooks, drivers, security, 24-hour shifts, all volunteers. And they basically turned this gymnasium-like facility into a large infant nursery until these kids could all be adopted out. Well, in the middle of all that, there was this horrible tragedy. This United States Air Force cargo plane was carrying 243 Vietnamese infants in shoeboxes, 38 nurses, all of them volunteers, a couple of school teachers. So he had about 40 women on board, and they all died with the children when a bomb went off, and it was raining babies from the sky over Saigon on April 4th of 1975. And that's when the CIA stepped in and said, oh, we can't take these infants anymore. It's too dangerous. So we can bring in these 3-foot, 4-foot kids, these really ugly-looking kids who all look like they have Methuselah syndrome and no hair. We want to bring them to the United States because these kids are all like progeria and Methuselah syndrome and shit. And the communists are going to kill them all because they're biologically deformed. And so we got to bring them to the United States out of mercy. Well, these were all Choctaw. And they brought them into the United States, 40,000 of them, and they had to feed. So at night, they fed off all these Laotian and Hmong tribesmen that were all in area in the same apartment building as me. And I know exactly what their symptoms were. They were described by the woman who ultimately was dealing with this problem, a medical anthropologist by the name of Dr. Shelley Adler. And Dr. Shelley Adler convinced Congress and the U.S. government this was a real problem. She said, look, 70% of the Hmong tribesmen and Laotians who have fled the Vietnam War are dead. The Cho have attacked 60% of all the Laotians and Vietnamese refugees in the United States. Every single male has been attacked by the Choctaw and has experienced a near-death experience or a near-Sun's experience, and many of them have died. Now, that's 3 times the normal United States population experience of the old hag syndrome. Now, she pointed out the fact that this was due to the central pillar. There was no central pillar in American houses or apartments for them to conduct sacrifices onto. And so first the government said, we'll convert them to Christianity. And they won't believe that crap. But it turned out that any of the Hmong who converted to Christ and abandoned their native spirit traditions had the highest fatality of death rate of all, 72% death ratio. So she said it doesn't work. They can't convert to Christ. We have to put them into the countryside where we can set up refugee camps. They can have village and clan groups and make their sacrifices to their ancestral pillar, or they're all going to die off and you're going to be responsible for genocide. So finally Congress funded a rural exodus into the countryside of the Hmong tribesmen and the Laotian refugees in 1981, between 1979 to 1981. and they began to make their sacrifices again, go back to their native traditions, and they stopped dying. And it was around that time that the symptoms of sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome began to be categorized, documented by Dr. Shelley Adler, because she had been working with this to convince Congress. And she said, the Da are known to be monsters beneath the earth who venture forth at night, but they're really something else. She couldn't identify what it was, but she said whatever it was caused, in the first stage of invasion of someone's bedroom or their place of sleep, a sense of panic, extreme fear, a second stage of paralysis, a third stage of chest pressure, a fourth stage of a sense of alien presence in the room that was neither animal nor human nor spirit, and the fifth stage was a sensational disturbance, auditory, visual, tactile, and finally the sixth stage was you'd wake up dead. And so she categorized all this. All of this is on record. All of this is vettable. People can look this up. And people, the only thing they're not going to be able to find out is, well, what happened? So they put all these people out in the countryside and they all stopped dying. What happened to the Chichewa? Well, aside from the fact that the triads, which is an Asian word for a criminal underworld gang or mafia type of cabal, the Cho triads run much of the Asiatic crime scene in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. That's why when I was working as a cop, I said, you people need to bring in translators who speak Cho-Cho. And I knew one, and I brought it to him. I said, this man speaks Cho-Cho. I have seen the Cho-Cho. My father had seen them in China. When I first saw the Cho-Cho, I was in that El Cerrito apartment complex. We all faced inward in this horrible little yard, you could call it like that, which surrounded by skyscrapers the size of our buildings, tall buildings. Ours was 10 stories tall for the Tenderloin. As far as I was concerned, it was like a skyscraper. It had 100 units, 10 units on each floor. Some of those units got entirely destroyed by fire. Some entire floors got destroyed by fire because the Hmong tribesmen in the Laotians had never worked with gas ovens and constantly blew themselves and their apartments up. So we had this situation where these people would use their toilets because they had never seen plumbing before or toilets. They would use that to wash their vegetables in. So we had very primal country people from out in the jungle trying to adapt to this new lifestyle while they were being attacked in their sleep at night and dying. Just a horrible nightmare scenario that I grew up in. And one time when I looked out at the other apartment, the entire building was shaking. This is why they have armies. When they cross a bridge, they make them break step, because if an army maintains march across a bridge, it can cause vibrations that will collapse the bridge. So we had a bunch of little men I thought were children that were all marching in step, in place, shaking the entire building across the street. And I said, what are they doing? And my father said, those are Chochoa. He said, I saw them in China. He said, they're performing a sacrificial ritual right now. And of course, it was this thing they had in a sack. I think it was a human infant. We couldn't see it because it was a squirming thing in a sack. Might have been a pig. I'm certain it was a human infant. And they stabbed the sack until it bled out into a chalice. And they were chanting. And my father said, that's a fertility ritual. They can't have babies normally. They have to kill in order to reproduce. It makes them fertile. And we called the police. The police, of course, never showed up in our area. And nothing was ever done. So whatever happened to the infant, it was too late. And we went back to our lives. But the Cho-Cho, when I described to other Asian people from Southeast Asia what I had seen and what I had saw, they said, well, that's impossible. No one sees the Cho-Choa. They're like the fairy folk in Europe, is how they interpreted them. Something that everyone knows about, but nobody sees. But that's because they didn't want to see them, because they thought to see them was certain death. I didn't come from that cultural matrix, so I didn't have that blinder. And I was able to see them, and my father identified them. And now, of course, you've got them running industries in the San Francisco Greater Bay Area, and their triads mark out their own territory. And, of course, their triads are responsible for various kinds of distributions of heroin, opium, various other kinds of drugs that are popular now and making a resurgence throughout the United States. But beyond the economics of it, how is it that these people are feeding? Well, it was around the time that all the Hmong tribesmen in the Laotians were transferred out into the countryside and relocated that Americans started getting nocturnal visitations from little alien greys.
As well as sudden infant death syndrome spiked up all around the country.
That's right. And that's when you had Whitley Strieber write Communion. And all the white people saw the little bald men. Your average Chihuahua has no bodily hair, not even eyelashes. And they saw all these little wizened, wrinkled, bald little men appearing astrally, looking gray. And they all said, oh, these Jim Yams must be aliens. I'm being persecuted at night by extraterrestrials. And, of course, Whitley Strieber was paid to write his book Communion so they could promote just that kind of pablum. So that's who they fed off of. Sudden infant death syndrome of the whites, tortured white adults, fed on their pain and their terror at night, and people see them all over the place and they don't know what they are. Well, now you do. So you have this entirely separate sentient subspecies of humanity that are deployed as assassins by your Central Intelligence Agency, now back under the supervision of your Department of Defense. You might wonder, how do they do this? How do they get away with it? Well, take a look at the Hmong tribesmen. Every single Cambodian or Hmong tribesman, barring very few exceptions, especially amongst the Hmong community, is on welfare. To give you an example of how this is not to degrade them or disparage them. They come from an entirely rural, farming, agricultural, jungle background. They have no ability to adapt to an industrial or post-industrial service society or economy at all. And the few that have done so have been like the Cambodians who have opened up donut shops all over the United States. The donut industry in the United States is heavily dominated by Cambodian immigrants. Now, aside from stuff like that, very few of them are employable. Very few of them can adapt to our lifestyle, and they still hunt in the woods for their food. And these people, of course, are, because of their way of life, dependent on welfare. And so when I had an example of this one clown I knew, if anyone watches Roswell and the Rising Sun, there's this clown who's turning the basically the slide reel for me, and he had a wife who was from Thailand, and she was making a killing for a year in the vitamin sales industry, because she turned to the Hmong community and she said, oh, we can all make money selling all these vitamins. And so they act as telemarketers, working out of their homes, helping her sell all these vitamins, and she became the top vitamin sales girl in the United States for that particular scam. And then it all fell apart when social workers told the Hmong people, hey, if you're working and employed, we have to cut your Social Security. We have to cut your welfare. And so they all stopped working just as soon as they had worked for her and brought her up to the top of the pyramid, where they were having her deliver all these presentations on how to be a successful sales girl and all that stuff, even though she didn't speak a word of English. So then this Thai girl went from the top salesperson of vitamins in the U.S. for this particular scam to crashing down to zero income, because the Hmong tribesmen, who had all been working for her as telemarketers, as soon as they were threatened by the social workers, their welfare was going to be stopped. They all stopped at once, just like, somebody swerving a ship and onto a different course. And so the government can do whatever they want with these people by threatening their economic livelihood. And that's why the Hmong and the Laotians were brought as chattel for the Chichewa. And when they were relocated by another branch of government, the U.S. Congress, thanks to Dr. Shelley Adler, then the military, initially the CIA, but then later now the Department of Defense, took over the Chichewa and redeployed them against you. And the Chichewa, aside from running all of this crime, are, of course, on welfare. So they're maintained by the DOD, by government checks, and their primary job is to terrorize you at night and kill you if you're targeted. Or even if you're not targeted, you're just food. So think about that and dwell on that. Think about the Japanese being...
And it was the ancestral offerings that kept them protected. One of the big things that I'm talking about is keeping your ancestors at peace, the 7 previous generations and the 7 future generations, and understanding how to come to balance with that. And I think that's a very key thing that you mentioned is as a connection with the land. And it's within that connection of the land, people were able to create a power grid and protection format that would limit the ability for things to feed upon you in a nighttime harvest scenario. which is something else I talk about in a big, big scenario hall. The sacred geometry cities, which are all done by Masons, have operators that maintain these sacred geometry places that collect ghosts and are traded amongst cities.
Yes, and I think that that's very important, especially in the, shall we say, the geomantic parameters of San Francisco and how screwed up it is as a
Oh yeah.
portal. We've gone into that before on a personal level, and we can go into that publicly again sometime in the near future. In the meantime, my Executrix producer, Laura Lee Solomon, has brought up the Nagas, which, of course, are somewhat connected with the Hachuri as a kind of different species of reptilian humanoid that is known throughout East Asia. And there is even a Naga people that people can look this up themselves and verify this. There are a tribe or a people known as the Naga. There is a Nagaland in Burma, Myanmar. And so she brings up an excellent point with that. Now, it's getting very late where she is. She's on Texas time. We may have to let her go soon. I believe it's about 10:30. It's bordering on 10:30 p.m. over there, and she has to get up very, very early in the morning. We'd best let her go. Are you going to stay with us for a while longer, Laura Lee, or how do you feel about that for tonight's pre-recording?
I'm good for the present.
Okay. Would you like to mention something about the Naga that you feel needs to be brought up that comes to mind?
No, but I was very fascinated with what you were saying, what you both were saying about the whole alien phenomena and the protection of one's ancestors. I
Right.
would be kind of interested in hearing that elaborated on a little further. How do people do that?
Yeah, how do they do that, Andrew? And by the way, we will certainly. So, can you stick with us for another 30 minutes before Andrew and I kind of go for maybe another half hour or an hour after that
Sure.
ourselves?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh, by the way, do we? This is going to be a question that needs some answering. Do we need you here with us to maintain the recording, or is that something that?
Yes, actually we
Okay.
do.
Oh God! Oh God! Well, answer her question, Andrew, and let's take advantage of her presence so we can continue.
So when it comes to protecting your you're doing ancestral protections. One of the first things is you have to declare your boundaries, and that is your bed is your first boundaries, and that's the four corners of your bedroom is where you take objects that you empower your protective information and structures with. I do not want my dream to be interrupted by something that is not an ancestor. I am not freely sharing my energy. I do not allow things to come into my dream times and alter my dream state unnaturally. And you make these statements in what I call contract revocation, invocation, where you declare your boundaries. And the next layer is you take objects and you impress your authentic signature frequency of protection into these items and place them in the four corners of your room. And then when you have children, you do the four corners of your house and then the four corners of your property, which creates three layers. So if any ancestral entity was wishing to interact with you or do some form of harm to you, it must go through three full layers of your will to get at the core being of you. The fourth layer is where you protect, the in between your bed and your mattress is that space that you can put protective objects and symbols that can do heavy forms of protecting you from the old maid sitting on your stomach, or the example, the chichewa that are feeding off of you over long periods of time, because they are harvesting feeding entities, and there's many different types of them. Some are non-corporeal, never take a physical form, but can feed on 40 or 50 people simultaneously because they've given enough power away in their own psychosis and fear of the being itself. By taking the fear away, giving yourself the adequate projective boundaries, and then create some form of ritual and ceremony that brings other ancestors into your protection. That is your angelic beings, your spiritual guardians, all the other things that you've worked with in the process of going to a more higher understanding of life values. To impress into your reality, I do no harm to any sentient kind, and any sentient kind that wishes to do me harm must deal with all seven past, present, and future ancestors in this moment of now, to create what I call spiritual courts of equity. So any sentient being wishes to work with you, it must go through the filter of ancestors, so all of its motives, positive, negative, could be understood by the unity factor of those ancestors who have already dealt with this type of species interaction. That's your out loud voice. And then from a magical process, it's to do alchemy. This is where I recommend people to brew their own beer. and it's never intended to be drunk. It is only intended to be used as an energy absorption process or an energy adding to an area. What I recommend is, if people are into this process of ancestral understanding, you make soups, you spread those around your yard. But when you get good enough at alchemy, when you're brewing your own beer, that beer is alive. You can put it under your bed, put it next to your bed as a very powerful talisman that is alive, that houses your signature frequency teachings of self-protection. Beer brewing is ancient of days. There are many esoteric traditions and practices that impress its magical properties into beer, alcohol, so on and so forth. Those will be the great tools of the next generation of sorcerers who wish to step forward and say, I wish to operate in spiritual hygiene, and I will make sure that my bedroom and my home doesn't have doorways for these entities to come in.
Okay. That's very important. I'm very glad that you have brought that up. And I think that while we still have the gift, of course, of Laura Lee Solomon with us, we'd best talk about some of what I think is important now with the current genocide that's going on of sentient beings. And you might think some of these sentiencies that I've described are somewhat deserving of genocide from what I have articulated. But that's not the case with all of them. And since we're speaking of relic populations, I want people to understand that there are relic populations that your government, that same United States government, which I have described as the ultimate of evils and serving the ultimate of evils, what they are at war with. Now, one of the things I brought up about the Choctaw was the immunity of the Japanese race to their nocturnal attacks. Their immunity was such that that's one reason why I feel no threat, being 25%, a quarter Japanese myself. My mother was half Japanese, half Chinese. Her father was Chinese. Her mother was Japanese, and a very rare combination for that time and day. And when she was born in Tokyo in 1923. And so I myself might have been vulnerable to the Choctaw, but obviously that Japanese quarter of myself genetically and in terms of bloodline has rendered myself immune.
You were a little too spicy for them.
Yeah, well, where does this immunity come from? Well, a lot of the immunity...
Exactly, where does it come from?
And the immunity comes from, according to the ancient and occult Japanese sources, to which my mother was definitely a student of. Her parental background was such that one of the reasons why a Chinese man was respected enough to be allowed to take on a Japanese bride during that day and age that was infamous for a lot of hostile interaction between Asians and the Japanese was because of the fact that her background from her father's side was of nobility, going back into the Manchurian nobility. And so her knowledge of the ancient days was maintained through her family bloodline, and she knew quite well of not only their origins, but also of the origins of the Japanese race itself. So we have the concept of the Japanese imperial line, and the Japanese imperial line is something that derives from the priesthood of the sunken continent of Mu. And these people who ruled or existed on that continent were known, of course, as the Muvians. And the Muvians were, of course, to play an enormous part in Japanese culture and ultimately in American culture in ways
before the Shinto religions really took over.
Yes. Well, they were part of the formation of the Shinto religion long before Buddhism. Before Buddhism, Shinto enfolded all things in Japan without
all ancestral wisdoms and magics, yeah.
That's right. With no doctrine, founder, or specific philosophy or moral code, it was forced to define itself and develop such when the beliefs of Buddha arrived in the capital of Nara about the time of the 6th century, which is just like yesterday in terms of Japan, because Japan's dynasty prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor had developed a plane that could fly all the way from Tokyo to New York nonstop as part of their attempt to celebrate the 2600th anniversary of the Yamato dynasty. So prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese imperial dynasty was already 2,600 years old.
That's not something that they want out there in the public notice.
That's something the Americans don't want out there in the public
Right.
notice because Japan, of course, is still an empire under constitutional rule of the emperor. Now, of course, we have Shinto, which was not at all subsumed by the new faith of Buddhism, but maintained its importance with the Japanese peoples by transforming into a shrine faith that was overseen by a priestly caste, and this class replaced the ancient clan shamanesses, which had existed prior to the arrival of Buddhism in the 6th century. But these shamanesses, this matriarchy, where did it come from? And even few Japanese realize this, just how far their imperial line can be traced back into time, even though everyone knows it's the oldest imperial line that's unbroken in all of human recorded history. No one knows that it goes back to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Well, the Japanese know that, but they don't know exactly how outside of the Shinto priesthood. And my mother found out about it through, of course, her royal connections through the Manchurian bloodline, which intermarried with the Japanese imperial bloodline and became subsumed by it during the time of Emperor Puyi and the dynasty of the last emperor of Manchuria, also known as the last emperor of China in American popular recollection. Now, it's no secret, of course, that the ethnic Japanese are not the original inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago at all. That honor goes to the Caucasian Ainu people now living in the cold climes of Hokkaido. But the ethnic Japanese arrived en masse on the islands around 25,000 years before Christ. And they were the last tattered remnants of a devastated civilization. They were named the Yayoi culture by archaeologists. And these survivors brought Shinto and a matriarchal leadership of the mammacy, the idea of a female papacy, to Japan, not in the Catholic sense, but in the sense of a Shinto faith. And kami faith, the faith in the gods of the nature that was all around us. And these kami shamanesses acted as leaders in each settlement. And with them they brought serpent motifs that permeate ancient Shinto, now existing in this highly stylized form, such as braided ropes that tie two rocks together in various islands all about Japan. And the kind of symbol that you see of that braided paper that looks very serpentine are sinusoidal, as was described by my executrix producer. So the serpents were important because the Yayoi came from the land of Mu, where man and Hachurui, or serpent person, existed side by side.
Was
And
probably at the time where what's considered the cavernous earth and the surface earth intertraded, interacted, interbred, warred, and fought, and all of the things before the common history was rewritten.
yes. And Amaterasu, or Kami-sama, the great sun goddess as she came to be known, was part of the elite class of the sorcerer priests in the Golden Empire of the Sun on the lost continent of Mu, where the serpent race and the human race coexisted for untold millennia, until the time of a great experiment and a great catastrophe. And it was around that time, of course, that there was apparently war between Lemuria and Atlantis and Mu, and there were desperate experiments that were conducted in order to carry out that conflict. And it was a time, of course, in which people attempted to interbreed or hybridize the Hachurui and humanity to form a third race in this tremendous struggle. Now, because of that, the Japanese people, in one way or another, all have Muvayan blood that burns in the veins, and their blood is not necessarily fully human. This is what makes them so definitely unique, is because they have, at the level of the Imperium, at the level of the imperial bloodline, a great degree of blood that's connected back to the Hachurui, or the serpent people of Mu, and those people that are less full-blooded in Japanese descent are more interbred with the Caucasoid Ainu of the islands, or the Mongolian or Sinitic peoples from China, but mostly from Northeast Asia and Korea and other races that have come onto the archipelago, of course. But the more interbred that they are with other humans, the less they are part of nobility. So when you think of the Japanese emperor and the imperial dynasty of Yamato, they are considered of familial stock, which is definitely of a purer blood that has a stronger strain of this serpentine or dragon bloodline. And
Thus, the creation of dragon-type families, not in our modern colloquial sense, but in the ancient colloquial sense, you were related to the dragon of this mountain, or you were related to the dragon of that mountain, which gave your ancestral relations to what this was settled by this tribe, and they kept a certain level of purity and allowed them to have breeding groups.
that's right. But in Japan, there is a hated and despised ethnic subculture known as Barukaman. And the Barukamen were forced to work with leather or dead bodies, which the average Japanese person would never touch. The Japanese, of course, because of the influence of Buddhism, were all strict vegetarians, not vegans, but vegetarians.
They still ate from the ocean.
Yes, they ate the fish from the ocean and the taco or octopus, etc., sea urchins, all seafood, but they were not meat eaters, which is one reason why they were also short and small in stature, but of course much healthier in terms of people, as people usually are, who refrain from eating meat. So the people who worked with leather or dead bodies were considered completely untouchable, and the reason that they were condemned to do so was, even though they appear ethnically identical to other Japanese, the Barukaman lack any Muvayan blood. So these were the more Mongoloid Japanese people of the lowest class with no serpentine or dragon blood within them that were condemned as Barukamen to this existence that was almost subhuman for untold generations. And they are still a despised community, which the Japanese don't even speak of to this day. So in terms of the people who managed to immigrate to Japan, that archipelago, from the fall of the continent of Mu, their leader, the sorcerer priestess Amaterasu, was a compassionate but detached princess of the clan of the sun, and she desired a means to watch over and protect her peoples. Her mortal shell was said to be dying at the time of the catastrophe, and she performed a powerful rite to merge her energies with the land itself and form an unbreakable bond, which forever metamorphosed into this incarnating, immortal soul that bound her to the sun and the land. And she became the first kami, which became the basis for Shinto. Losing
beautiful relation to have, the first kami.
Yes, losing all of the remnant of her old human consciousness, and except for that of the instinctual.
Yeah, she became the bridge between the ancestors living and the ancestors of the future. She became that medium to that understanding.
Yes, with the instinctual desire to protect her descendants. And there was no option except total dissolution of the body and soul. So the rest of the weakened and dying Muvayan sorcerers followed suit, and this left only the native raw materials of the island chains to carry on. And within a few generations, the Yayoi emigres forgot the kindred spirits of the kami and came to worship these mysterious, powerful, unseen entities as gods in the nature spirit sense,
in the shamanistic sense, with the ism towards women.
Yes, and only those of the imperial line surviving in Amaterasu's grandson remembered the secret and the great sacrifice of the kami. But that's also where we get the tori, or the gates, that are shaped like the Greek pie, that are all over the islands of Japan. So when we had the sorcerer priestess Amaterasu open the massive dimensional portals from the sinking continent of Mu to the Japanese archipelago, this enabled the safe passage of hundreds of thousands of Muvayan mortal citizens, and who created the Yayoi culture in what was said to be teleportation from the technology of the time. But as a consequence of opening these powerful gateways, the corporeal reality of the Japanese island chain was destabilized. And even though 25,000 years have passed, the flux in the earth realm has never really settled. And partially this is due to the continued presence of the kami.
Very well put. And one of the things that I talk about is the Earth went as at a time where it broke down into about 5,800 separate bubbles of reality, just as you've just described that the Isles of Japan was protected by an overseered ancestral spirit. What I said, it broke down to 2,600 versions of that, and another 8,000 versions of that just underground. So there are 10,000 plus local bubbles of reality that each was one by one conquered by the various conquerors of our modern history. Whether it
Yes.
was into absolute desolation, so you would never hear about it, like the Ghoul or the other versions, or ones that were incorporated back in, such as the Chochoa, into the modern criminal society, because that was the perfect place for those predators.
That's right. And, because of what we've both been describing, like I said, even though many thousands of years have passed, this flux in the Earth realm has never really settled, and this is partially due to the continual presence of the kami,
Which
or
is
the
thus
nature
the
spirits.
Dragon Triangle in the ocean that connects all those islands via teleportation tunnels, or the ancestral gate tunnels, which are now protected by the individual kami of the individual Shinto shrines.
That's
Each
right.
shrine was a moon portal, or some form of portal that could connect you to another one, which led you down like a treasure hunt of places to go to find what portal led to the right realm.
That's right. And keep in mind, for the general public, the Dragon's Triangle is, of course, Asia's version right off the coast of the islands of Japan, their version of the Bermuda Triangle, where much takes place in terms of ufological phenomenon, or USO, or undersea submersible objects, or unidentified submersible objects, etc. Various other kinds of sightings of creatures or cryptozoology take place. So it is a place of this tier in the fabric of space and time. And the kami, of course, are now bonded to every physical component in the region. They bestow a spiritual component to inanimate objects. And because of that, reality's never been able to heal properly with the kami bound and around, and the dimensional instability is strongest wherever the gifted shamans have erected torii on these various rensa, or nexus points of power. And the very shape and form of the torii gates themselves are the remnant of a Muvayan high technology of teleportation. Now, the thousands of torii erected across the face of Japan have become passive portals, and they further ensure the unstable dimensional composition of the land of the rising sun. And this, of course, was rendered highly unstable, even more further so, by the detonation of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which have succeeded in damaging the space-time matrix and causing hundreds of temporal and dimensional rifts between Earth and Yomi, the land of the dead, the realm of the hungry spirit.
Beautifully put it. I talk about the Dragon Trial as one of Earth's major paradoxes that it created for itself.
Yes, yes. And, of
And
course,
it's what the extra-dimensional beings are using as the backdoor portal into this reality.
That's right. And because of this, the greater kami, the former Muvayan wizards and sorcerers, are acutely aware of the menace of the extra-cosmic anti-gods, the great old ones,
Bingo.
the outer gods, and the threat they pose to humanity. And, of course, in their roles as the self-appointed guardians of the land of the rising sun, they basically are simply rooted to the spot, and they are very much limited by their nature of manifestation in Japan itself, but their greatest ability to protect Japan is to mobilize the elements around it. And in this sense, Japan is one of the safest places in the world that is immune from the predations of these elder gods and outer gods, which the American military has been attempting to harness. Now, much of this strength of Japan comes from its connection to the sunken continent of Mu. In 1185, the ruling clan of Japan, the Heika, were fighting for their survival against a rival clan, the Genji. And this is recounted in one of the most famous stories of ancient Japan, the tale of the Heika. And the Heika Emperor of Japan, and Toku, was only 7 years old, and his grandmother, the Empress Dowager Kiyomori, held the actual power. When the Genji asserted a superior ancestral claim to the throne, this sparked a civil war that lasted over 5 years and tore apart the archipelago. And it climaxed in a sea battle that occurred at Danoura in the Shimonoseki Strait off the southern tip of Honshu in the year 1185 on April 24th. Now, because they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the noble Heike samurai threw themselves into the ocean rather than suffer the dishonor of capture. And Lady Kiyomori fled with Antoku in a fishing boat, vowing that the Genji would never take the young emperor. Now, at her bidding, the child put his hands together and turned to the east. They said farewell to the god of Yese, and then they turned west. They recited the Nambutsu, a prayer to the Bodhisattva Amitabha. And the Lady Kiyomori took him in her arms and said together as they jumped into the waves, her final words were, "In the depths of the ocean is our capital." Now, it's said that the Heike warriors, of course, still walk the bottom of the sea in the form of crabs. But the reality is that during the Second World War, the American Navy began to encounter all kinds of phenomena that gave them the idea that the legend of the Heike crabs, which are spoken of in a very ignorant and stupid sense by Carl Sagan in his television series Cosmos, as being given much more of a chance to breed because the Japanese wouldn't eat them. Well, the Japanese never ate them because they taste terrible and there's not much meat in them, and it had nothing to do with selection based on superstition. No one knows why the Heike crabs have the faces of samurai inscribed on the backs of their shells. And certainly this mythos provides as good as an explanation as anything that Carl Sagan came up with, which was entirely stupid and fallacious and had nothing to do with reality. But it was known that the Japanese felt that these were spies or reconnaissance, these crabs, for the underworld continent or the undersea continent of Mu and its empire, the shogunacy beneath the sea. And it was further known that that empire communicated through the use of dolphins and whales. Now, of course, whatever the Japanese have done in terms of whaling compares not at all to the damage that the Americans have done with their genocide of the cetaceans and the whales. Now, keep in mind that India is the fourth nation on Earth to outlaw the use of dolphins in SeaWorld type shows, and they're the first nation on Earth to declare dolphins officially as non-human or non-human persons. Yes. But the reason that they did that is because this was recommended by Western scientists who have proven that dolphins are far more intelligent than human beings.
Right, and there was a person that in the late 1980s, Alexander Nesterov, who proved that the horse can learn to spell, and did it in front of the whole Communist Party, actually.
Well, yes. Now think of that with the dolphins, who have been proven to have a far greater cranial capacity than human beings, are able to communicate at far greater nuances with their sonar and their distance. And, of course, during the Second World War, the Americans began to suspect this with their submarine losses in fighting the Empire of Japan. In terms of what happened in World War II, the Americans deployed their submarines against the Japanese Empire and found themselves fighting a two-front war against an undersea force that they could not identify. The United States submarine losses were supposed to be non-existent because supposedly there was nothing the Japanese had to fight American submarines with, other than, of course, mine warfare and sea mines, depth charges. There were, of course, gunning down of submarines. Plenty of submarines were admitted to have been lost to enemy action, but there were plenty of mysterious losses. Now, overall,
the whole issue with the torpedoes at the very beginning of the World War II, where an entire series of torpedoes was said to have a major issue with its firing trigger.
That's right. That's right. Well, the Americans, of course, built the worst torpedoes in the world. But adding to that were other mysterious malfunctions. Very important to remember, the Americans brag about their silent service all the time. They talk about the fact that the submarine service of the United States Navy was 1.6%, literally less than 2% of all Navy personnel during the war, but they accounted for over half, over 55% of all Japanese ships sunk, including 1/3 of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Navy. And, of course, they suffered in turn the highest casualty percentage of all American armed forces. They lost 1 in 5 submariners. Some 16,000 submariners served during World War II, of whom 375 officers and 3,131 enlisted men were killed. That accounts for about 3,505 submariners lost during World War II, along with 52 submarines. That's the highest percentage casualty rate of any branch of service, 23%. So with that, you have something that is not supposedly a mystery in and of itself, but you have a mystery in losses which the Americans only were able to identify as cause unknown. And those cause unknown cases were what I was able to see documents thereof, because they came through Treasure Island and were collated from that naval base to the Presidio military base, where I was able to see the fact that they felt they were taken by an undersea intelligence allied with the Japanese.
There you go. Making all the connections.
And when it came to that, the Americans declared war, which never ended. That's why in this day today, you have the American High Command. Now, people who doubt me can look this up and vet it for themselves. The American High Command is obsessed with always maintaining the capability of fighting a 2.5 front war. Now, where does that strange concept come from? What does that mean? A 2.5 front war. What it means is that during World War II, they fought against the Third Reich in Europe, they fought against the Japanese in the Pacific, and there was a half front, a hidden front, the covert front of what was going on underseas, where the United States Navy was fighting a secret battle that was life or death against forces unknown and unidentifiable. What they called, since the beginning of 1942, the underwater empire of Mu. And, of course, this was wiping their sailors and submarines out from under the waves. And as a result, they have been since obsessed with destroying that undersea empire, and its primary method of communications is through non-human persons or dolphins and whales and porpoises. And so they have been purposefully, intentionally killing them with sonic weaponry ever since, in the millions. Make no mistake about it, the covert documents that I dealt with do not talk about hundreds like they bring up to the public and officially admit to, or thousands, which is what the environmental activists have proven incontrovertibly, inarguably have been killed. The United States Navy has killed millions of whales and dolphins the world over with undersea, extremely low frequency sonar and various other forms of acoustic weapons in order to devastate the logistics of this undersea empire. Now, when people want to know how sonar harms these species of beautiful animal, it is something where the Navy will deny the facts, but you have a situation in which they use 235 decibel pressure waves of unbearable pinging and metallic shrieking. At 200 decibels, if this were audible to you on the surface world, the vibrations would rupture your lungs. And above 210 decibels, the lethal noise would literally bore a hole straight through your brain until it hemorrhaged that delicate tissue. And if you're not deaf after this devastating sonar blast, you're dead. And this is the real life of marine mammals destroyed by the United Navy's all-out acoustical war on the world's oceans. Every inch of the world's oceans is attacked by the United States Navy nonstop. And because of all these millions of dying whales and dolphins, because they're all out of human sight, they're out of mind. But I'm here to tell you, other nations are now recognizing them as non-human persons. And as non-human persons, this means your Navy is responsible for the genocide of millions and millions of NTIs, non-terrestrial intelligences.
Yep. Something I've said for many, many years now. There's 7,300,000,000 human beings, and then there's 50 billion sentient beings that live on this world we haven't even been introduced to yet.
Yes, that's quite true. I think that that's what that's about all we can tolerate now for your audience, baby. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was looking at a text from Lori Lori Lee Solomon. She had to put baby girl, her cat, in the cat's room. so, so yes, but yes, I think that we need to baby our audience, and that really we've taken them to the edge of what they can handle. I think with this discussion, but we've spoken of relic populations. People now know we are at war with a non-human empire beneath the sea, which covers the majority of our planet's surface. As I said, there's far more water beneath the surface of the Earth than there is water above the surface, but that water above the surface is 3/4 of our planetary surface. And to put this into perspective for you, as the United States of America, as the aggressor in this war, it is very important to remember that the United States has far more territory in the ocean legally under United States official jurisdiction and occupation than it does on the continent of North America. It's called an EEZ, or an exclusive economic zone. So when you take the exclusive economic zone of fishing rights, mineral exploitation rights, if they ever get to the point of developing the ocean floor for its invaluable and priceless minerals such as tantalum, which comes from meteorites that have struck the Earth from space, which we line our cell phones with and comprise the majority of technology behind our modern communications in terms of transmission, this tantalum is sourced mainly on the surface world from Africa. The fight of private corporations hiring private mercenary armies to gain control of these mineral regions in the Congo has led to the death of 5 million Africans on that continent. And none of this is something you've ever heard about, but it's all the blood that goes into your cell phones.
Same thing like the blood diamonds, it's a blood other mineral.
That's right. Tantalum, which is not an earthly or terrestrial mineral. It comes from space. It comes from meteorites. And, of course, much of the surface of the world was once underwater, and much of what was once underwater was once the surface. So there's tantalum on the ocean floors that dwarfs what's in Africa. And America maintains control over much of that tantalum with its mineral rights at the bottom of the sea on the seabed.
As well as access to those communities if they're technologically organized, which at some level, they're got to be technologically organized as well as spiritually organized.
Yes, well, Mu, the Empire of Mu, is concluded by your United States government. This undersea shogunacy, allied to Japan, is concluded to be a post-singularity civilization.
There you go.
And in terms of what the Americans are doing, they're messing with an empire that could strike back with scalar weapons and literally melt and dissolve coastlines across the world.
Reality-altering and devastation weapons.
Yes, and America occupies the majority of this empire in their own demented, twisted mind through their exclusive economic zone or their territorial seas. And their territorial seas are stretching out 200 nautical miles from the coastline of any American coast or island. Mm-hmm. So that means Alaska, Hawaii, the United States Pacific coast.
Basically adding 20% surface area to the United States.
That's right. Well, beyond that, when you take account the Northern Marianas, the Johnston Atoll, Howland and Baker Islands, Wake Island, American Samoa, Palmyra Atoll and Kingman Reef, Jarvis Island, Guam, and all of that put together, stretching out 200 nautical miles, the United States is huge. The world's third or fourth largest nation on this planet by total area of land and water. It's actually the second largest in the world after Russia, and it is something that no American knows about because they don't realize that the majority of American territory is in the Pacific Ocean. If you take a look at America's territory in the Pacific Ocean, we have something that covers an enormous amount of square mileage through its exclusive economic zones. As a matter of fact, the largest nation in the world, when you count its maritime zones, is France. The second largest in the world is the United States. And when you compare the square mileage of the United States, we're talking something like 4 million 723,729 square miles of area that the United States has in the Pacific, and only 3,806,000,000 square miles on the North American continent. We've got more territory
in the ocean
than we have here. And that America is occupying that territory violently by trying to wage war against a superior civilization, which is far more developed than we are, that may ultimately strike back by literally disintegrating our very continent from which we are waging this aggression.
But this has been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries, each in a different form, whether it was the East India Trading Company that was trying to break into the Asiatic countries to ultimately get to the Moose societies, or the early settlers of the early days. It's all interreacted through the Templars. All of this relates to the bigger story. As both historians here, we understand that this comes to something. This
Yes.
ultimately comes to the bigger thing of why you became a whistleblower, was that this information needed to get out.
That's right. And because it's 11 p.m. Texas time, I'd like to ask my Executrix producer, Laura Lee Solomon, we could use some reality altering, and that's what you teach people to do for themselves on your show, Paths of the Great Adventure. Tell us about that, and give us the time that it's on and days that it's on, and tell us about, a little bit about what they can do now in response to everything that I've just said, which is profoundly disturbing, I would hope, to everyone listening. What do you
This
have
will
to say?
make a great Halloween show.
Yeah. Yes. Well, hopefully
We've got it in time for Halloween, don't we?
Yes, we do.
What I teach is to people to create their own worlds using their own imaginative powers. And that is a basic exercise I set my listeners to using Key 1 of the Tarot, which is the function of attention and their imaginations. Basically, as I called it a concentration practice, but it is really a creative practice. It's both things. They work hand in hand. But anybody can imagine, and that is the context in which the work goes forward there. My show airs from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. Eastern Time on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. It's Paths of the Great Adventure. It's all about the tarot and Kabbalah, and spiritual practices, of course.
That's wonderful. And that helps us on an individual level to alter our reality towards a positive, at least on an individual level, where we can hopefully alter consciousness everywhere and bring an end to this madness by the military junta which runs your government. And I definitely want to emphasize that this is a positive place where we could end this conversation now. And we want to both thank Andrew Bartzies for making this possible, and certainly for helping to draw out the information from us with the best of all possible hostings that he's provided. Wonderful human being, the galactic historian, with his GNN, his Galactic News Network, with a wonderful purpose in life. And we want to keep him in our thoughts and prayers, and we want to direct people to the activities that he does, and how beneficial they are to all of us in terms of enhancing our awareness at a cosmic level. And I myself, my own program is Critical Omissions on Tuesday nights, and the Saturday Night Firing Lines on the weekend. And both of those are 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time we're on right now, until the near future, when we change back and fall back into standard. And I do want to remind people that is because we're on wartime. The entire daylight savings is wartime. It was originally instituted by Woodrow Wilson in World War I. It was revoked at the end of the First World War. It was started again by Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the Second World War, and we have never been taken off of it because the Second World War has never ended. While it ended with victory for the surface nation of Japan on the Japanese archipelago in 1952. Yes, you can look that up and vet it. at the Presidio military base. The Japanese-American peace treaty was signed. The Treaty of San Francisco went into effect the birthday eve day of Emperor Hirohito in 1952. Till that point in time, the Empire of Japan and the United States and Great Britain were legally at war. It ended in Japanese victory, and now that war continues against the Thousand-Year Reich in exile in Unterland, and it continues against the Empire of Mu, or the Undersea Muvayan Shogunacy, which is a very, very dangerous aggression indeed. And that's why we're still on wartime. Now, that's part of the madness. Get us off wartime, get us out of the war, and we can work with these non-terrestrial intelligences towards peace, or at least coexist without disturbing each other in this genocidal madness which your military junta is responsible for. And they've gotten Congress to support them, and they continue to play what they call war games. There's no game